Chapter 77. After the panic, Su Huanli looked at Su Li differently. His eyes were full of relief and pride. He didn't expect that Su Li could become a better person than his eldest brother so soon. Of course, if Su Huanli knew that Su Li extorted 600,000 taels of silver and 2 pieces of land from the Su family during this period, he would want to kill her. Li, you must do well in the Qinghe girls' school. Don't lose the face of our Su family. Yes, father. The scene in the Jinyuan court became extremely harmonious, as if there was no gap between the father and the daughter. As the news spread, the whole town knew that Su Li became a lecturer of the Qinghe girls' school. Li Shanbao was temporarily detained. Ning Qing posted the decree of the satrap on the bulletin board. Every day, countless people came to see it. Even people from the nearby towns came. The satrap was the highest position in the entire Qinghe province. Naturally, people had to see the decree written by such a person in person. With this decree, Su Li's reputation spread completely. The Mei family also got the news in the evening. Miss, great news. Gua jumped in from outside the door and her face was full of joy. Mei Ruhan frowned and asked, is it related to Li? For her, the good news that had nothing to do with Su Li was not good news. The Yang family was so aggressive that even their business was affected. They wanted to force her to admit her mistakes. But she didn't let it go. Many people in the family were dissatisfied. She didn't know how Su Li was now. The Su family would not protect her. Miss, it's the news of Miss Su Li. Gua said excitedly. Mei Ruhan's face immediately brightened. What's the good news? Gua, tell me quickly. When Gua was about to say it, a sweet voice suddenly came from outside the door. Henin, the good news. A rich woman with gorgeous makeup came in from the door and said kindly, your friend named Su Li was recruited by the Qinghe girls' school as a student. She is so lucky. Fourth aunt. Mei Ruhan stood up and saluted. A trace of disgust flashed in her eyes. She remembered that the fourth aunt said that she was short-sighted and a sinner of the Mei family a few days ago. She changed her words quickly. Madam, you're wrong. Gua stood out and said angrily, I heard that Miss Su was a lecturer in the Qinghe girls' school. How could she become a student? The wealthy-looking woman's expression immediately darkened. Why are you interrupting? Han, look at how much you've spoiled your own maidservant. Maybe one day she'll climb over my head, and you won't do anything about it. Mei Ruhan slightly pursed her lips and said in a cold tone, I will take care of Xiaohan's maids. You don't need to say more. The fourth madam's expression changed slightly before returning to normal. She snorted and said, Fine. Your father can do whatever you want. I can't be bothered to care. On the other hand, the rumor sounded extremely exaggerated. Su Li is only a teenager. How could she go to the school to be a lecturer? It's impossible. Speaking of this, the fourth madam showed a distressed look. She is successful, but what about you? The ban on the Muyang girls' school has not been withdrawn. If you don't apologize for one day, our Mei family will suffer with you. You have to think clearly. I'm not wrong. Why should I apologize? Mei Ruhan said angrily, even my father supports me. Fourth madam, you are so diligent to come here. Did you receive any benefits from the Yang family? The fourth madam's expression changed immediately. She said, How is it possible? Han, you can eat whatever you want, but you can't say whatever you want. I try my best to think about our family. How can I be partial to outsiders? At this moment, the old butler came from the yard and said in a hurry with a happy face, Miss, follow me to the front yard. The people of the Qinghe provincial office are coming. Mei Ruhan's beautiful eyes widened slightly. She seemed to think of something and smiled happily. Then she went out of the room without saying anything. Why do the people of the Qinghe provincial office come here? Could it be that what was said was true? It's impossible. I also want to go and have a look. The fourth madam was stunned and immediately followed. At this moment, in the front yard, the head of the Mei family was looking at the young people who came suddenly with a smile. He was well informed and knew the identity of these people. They were absolutely the trusted subordinates of the satrap. How respected they were. At this moment, they suddenly came to his home. He also just got the news of the Desu town. But these people came before he had time to read it. He also asked what happened. But this group of people ignored him and said expressionlessly that they wanted to see his daughter, Mei Ruhan. He faintly guessed something and was ecstatic, but he was afraid that he would be disappointed if he showed it. At this moment, Mei Ruhan came in from outside and said, "Father, I'm here." The head of the Mei family quickly stood up and took Mei Ruhan's hand. He said repeatedly, "Han, come and meet these officials of the Qinghe provincial office." The young leader also stood up and said with a smile, "Miss Mei, you don't have to be so polite. We come here to deliver a message for Lecturer Su." Su? Lecturer Su? Mei Ruhan was stunned for a moment, and then the joy in her pupils enlarged rapidly. She couldn't help but be excited and said, "Does Su Li really become a lecturer of the Qinghe Girls' School?" The young man smiled and nodded slightly. The lecturers of the Qinghe Girls' School have a quota of recommendation every year. After Lecturer Su knew it, she immediately introduced Miss Mei. "Please prepare for it these days. 3 days later, we will go to the Qinghe Girls' School. If there is any inconvenience, just tell me." Mei Ruhan was stunned for a moment. After a while, her eyes were covered with a layer of mist. She covered the waist of the head of the Mei family and cried. The head of the Mei family sighed softly and smiled happily. This girl had been under a lot of pressure recently. Seeing this, the young man smiled more. This was like a teenage girl. As for Su Li, when he thought of the girl's unchanged expression when she heard the good news, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. After that, the young man left 2 people to escort Mei Ruhan and then left the Mei family. The 4th madam heard it clearly at the door. She stood in the same place stupidly and her heart was in turmoil. The rumor turned out to be true. The 15-year-old girl not only became a lecturer of the Qinghe Girls' School, but also took Mei Ruhan to the school. Why didn't such a good thing happen to her Ning? Thinking of the agreement between her and the Muyang Girls' School, the 4th madam looked gloomy. Now, it was impossible to send Ning to the school. In the next 3 days, Su Li stayed in the Su house and didn't go anywhere. The identity of the Baichao Tang couldn't be exposed. Otherwise, there would be trouble if Qi Xianqing was involved. The yard in the valley couldn't be exposed either. Otherwise, what she did secretly would no longer be a secret. Fortunately, there was a place in the Qinghe province. Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan would soon seal the valley and go to the Qinghe province to find her. On the morning of the 4th day, a large carriage stopped in front of the Desu town. Many people got up early to say goodbye to Su Li. They were full of guilt, but they didn't know how to apologize. They were not qualified to apologize, so they could only say goodbye to Su Li. Mei Ruhan got off the carriage. She saw Su Li again after a few days, but it seemed that it had been a long time. When she saw Su Li smile, she immediately cried. Guo also shed tears. Su Li just touched Mei Ruhan's small head with a gentle smile. At that moment, it was like hundreds of flowers in full bloom. The elite soldiers of the Qinghe province were all swayed and had cold sweat on their foreheads. They had always thought about Su Li's talent and learning, but they didn't find that Su Li was as beautiful as a fairy. She was quite charming. "Let's go." Ning Qing glanced at the people of the Desu town and gently squeezed the horse's belly. Suddenly, the sound of hooves was heard. The carriage set off. Suddenly, there was a shout from the people. "Miss Su Li, have a nice trip." "Miss Su Li, I'm sorry. We won't believe the rumor anymore." "Miss Su Li, take care." The voice behind her was getting farther and farther, louder and louder, and finally smaller and smaller. Mei Ruhan heard it with tears in her eyes. She clutched her chest tightly. Her heart was surging as if there was hot magma flowing through her. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly, and her gaze did not waver at all. She gently lifted the curtain and looked at the scenery outside. The first step of the plan could finally start. Ning Qing took care that Su Li and Mei Ruhan were ordinary people, so they walked very slowly. They didn't arrive at the gate of the Qinghe province until noon the next day. The officers and soldiers guarding the gate saw the sign of the Qinghe provincial office and immediately let them pass. Mei Ruhan leaned against the window and looked here and there. She couldn't help but say excitedly, "Li, the Qinghe province is so big and lively. Look at that restaurant. It is so high. It has 5 floors." Su Li nodded with a smile and glanced at the golden plaque on the 5th floor. Tinya House. Mei Ruhan kept chattering along the way, which made the young man beside the carriage laugh in his heart. This little girl named Mei Ruhan was really cute. The carriage went all the way through the Qinghe town and stopped in front of the gate of the Qinghe school in the west of the city. As the most important educational institution in the entire Qinghe province, the Qinghe school occupied half of the size of the west of the city. The other half was also a satellite town with the Qinghe school as the center. Most of the people living in it were students, or students who were about to enter the school, or take the preliminary examination. Su Li glanced at the scattered taverns and inns, and a thought flashed in her heart. 10 months ago, the eldest brother, Su Qingtan, should also live in one of these inns, waiting for the preliminary examination. After the carriage stopped, the escorting elite soldiers left. Only Ning Qing, Su Li, and Nanny Li were left. Mammy Li and Gua each held their luggage and looked at the huge golden characters, Qinghe School, that were several feet high. They sighed with emotion. I didn't expect that I could enter such a place one day. Thanks to Miss Su Li, Gua looked intoxicated, and then looked at Mammy Li beside her. She felt strange. The expression of the old Mammy was a bit strange. It seemed that she was recalling something. Did she come here before? Mammy Li's eyes were full of tears, and the throbbing in her heart almost couldn't stop. Old miss, I didn't expect that I could come here again in this life. Old miss, I'm sorry. I lost the little miss. Ning Qing led Su Li and others to the side door beside the gate with ease. When the guard saw Ning Qing, he immediately bowed his head and saluted. Lecturer Ning. Su Li was a little surprised when she heard the words. Do you think it's strange? Ning Qing said without looking back, I was originally a lecturer here. Only because of my father, I went to the Muyang girls' school. I have to thank you for this. Otherwise, I don't know how long my father would stay in the Muyang town. Su Li's eyes flashed, and she tentatively asked, What is Mr. Ning's identity here? Ning Qing smiled and said, You will know it later. Let's go. I will take Ruhan to go through the process of the entrance examination first. Mei Ruhan was shocked when she heard the words, and a trace of tension appeared on her ruddy face. But when she thought of the homework she had done these days, confidence emerged in her eyes. The sallow-faced administrator of the enrollment office saw Ning Qing coming and immediately said with a smile, Lecturer Ning, long time no see. As soon as you come back, you bring 2 good students? This is a bit against the rules. The rules are rigid. Even you can only recommend 1 student a year. Chapter 78. When the yellow-faced administrator saw Su Li's immature face, he was so shocked that he almost choked. After a while, he calmed down and stared at her. He said incredulously, She, the lecturer? Ning Qing immediately signaled Su Li with her eyes. Su Li took out a brand-new jade token with the words, Su Li written on it, and the unique engraving of the Qinghe girls' school. It couldn't be fake. It turns out that you were Su Li, the one chosen by the satrap. The yellow-faced administrator was suddenly enlightened, and then he showed a meaningful expression. This matter had long been spread in the school. Many people were not convinced that Su Li was the youngest lecturer in the history of the school. However, these contradictions couldn't be controlled by a small administrator. She took Su Li's token and quickly completed the admission examination formalities for Mei Ruhan. Mei Ruhan and Gua stayed here. Ning Qing passed through the teaching area and took Su Li to a temporary courtyard to settle down. After sitting down, Ning Qing finally said, Your identity as a lecturer was given by the satrap himself. So, it's no problem for you to recommend Mei Ruhan. But the subject you are going to teach is very problematic. So, this is the reason why I live in a temporary courtyard? Su Li pointed at the words on the door. Ning Qing secretly thought that this woman was so careful. Then she nodded and said, The examination for you will begin tomorrow morning. Don't lose my father's face. You should at least show that you are excellent in one aspect. I heard that you have good attainments in embroidery. It's better to show it tomorrow. Su Li nodded slightly to show that she understood. Next, I will tell you the rules of the school. In fact, as a lecturer, there are few rules, but Ning Qing pointed at the high wall in the distance. You can't go there. Su Li looked along the direction and couldn't help but ask, What is that place? It's the martial arts field. Ning Qing raised her eyebrows and said, The Qinghe Girls' School is not a small place like the Muyang School. It occupies half of the West City. Do you think that it only teaches poetry and female workers? You can read the details in this booklet. It should have been sent to you by a special person. I will give it to you by the way. Su Li took a thick booklet and nodded to thank her. She was not familiar with the people and the place, so she needed to figure out the distribution of the Qinghe School. Ning Qing roughly explained and left a lot of needlework for Su Li to practice. Then she left. She had done her best. Mammy Li was busy making the bed. Although she would only stay here for one night, she wanted to make the miss as comfortable as possible. Su Li opened the booklet and read it quietly. The Qinghe School deserved to be the first school in the Qinghe province. It was divided into two schools, the girls' school and the boys' school. Then it was further divided into two branches, the civil school and the military school. Learning the civil school to be an official was a test of the brain. The most important thing in learning martial arts was one's root and talent. Of course, they also had to learn culture. If they could master both the pin and the sword, they would be heavily nurtured by the academy and enter the Special First Academy. Students who graduated from the Institute of Martial Arts would usually enter various violent organizations in the imperial court or enter the military. There were also those who were not outstanding who were hired by their families to become instructors or guards. For children from poor families, there were no big wars now, but there were constant small-scale wars. It was faster for them to enter the military. If they could show enough potential in military strategy, they might even be promoted 3 levels and quickly climb up the status. The reason why Ning Qing didn't let Su Li go to the martial arts field was that there were often people who practiced martial arts. Although the students in the girls' school of martial arts were female, some of them were more terrible than male students. Swords had no eyes. If they were accidentally hurt, it would be fatal. After roughly understanding the distribution, Su Li had lunch and learned about the various types of courses in the girls' school. Ning Yunji fulfilled her wish and let her become a lecturer. She could come here to read rare books. Of course, she couldn't waste too much time on teaching. There were many courses in the girls' school. The Muyang Girls' School only had literature, embroidery, and women's morality. The Qinghe Girls' School was divided into courses such as literature, calligraphy, embroidery, morality, zither, chess, calligraphy, painting, etiquette, medicine, and cooking. The Qinghe Girls' School knew that learning was not proficient. Therefore, the new students could only choose one course to learn each year. After learning to a certain level, they could take the examination. After passing, they could choose the next course. This method was similar to what her husband taught her in the previous life. Zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting were definitely not good. Although her husband taught her a lot in the previous life, and she gained a lot in Jianghu later, her foundation was still too shallow. Moreover, she didn't want to hand over what her husband taught her. Literature was easy to get thirsty. No. Calligraphy was easy to have problems if the handwriting was too exposed. No. Morality was the same as literature. No. Cooking was contrary to her upcoming plan. No. Su Li shook her head again and again. Finally, her eyes fell on the last name. She couldn't help but smile bitterly in her heart. She didn't expect that she would choose this one in the end. In the morning of the next day, a manservant came to the temporary courtyard to wait. Su Li followed him to a spacious teaching room. As soon as she entered the door, she attracted dozens of eyes. At the same time, the sound of discussion in the room disappeared completely. It was silent. Su Li glanced around the room and saw a large circular platform in the center of the room with a radius of 100 square meters. The seats around the platform were full of people. There were men and women, old and young. They were all over 25 years old and wore different colors of the Qinghe School's lecturers' uniforms. Su Li counted roughly and found that there were more than 50 people. Ning Qing sat among them and was secretly shocked. There were only more than 70 lecturers in the entire Qinghe Girls' School of Literature. Now, more than half of them came. When she came here, there were only more than 20 people who came to see her. Su Li's age was really too attractive. At this moment, the white-haired old lady sitting in the middle of the seats saw Su Li calmly walking to the middle of the field with a calm expression. She couldn't help but nod slightly. Just this presence alone was enough to make her peers feel ashamed. It must be known that when she was only 15 years old, She was still a little girl who only knew how to read books and didn't know the ways of the world. My daughter, Su Li, greets the lecturers of the Qinghe Girls' School. Su Li's voice was clear and resounded in the whole field. Many people were amazed, but more people were still doubtful and expressionless. Su Li, I am Wenruomin, the dean of the Qinghe Girls' School. Today, I will preside over the subject test for you. Do you have a favorite course? If you put it forward by yourself, we can save a procedure. Wenruomin's voice was kind. She got a lot of news from Qingning. Su Li's attainments in literature and embroidery were good, but she didn't know whether she could reach the level of teaching and educating people. Su Li nodded slightly and said, I choose embroidery. Hearing this, Ning Qing was relieved. This girl finally had some self-awareness and didn't choose literature. The dean's attainments in literature were unfathomable. It would be difficult to test literature, but it didn't mean that it was easy to test embroidery. Among the lecturers, at least 3 were top embroidery artificers. Their embroidery works could be sold at a sky-high price in the auction house. Wenruomin was slightly disappointed when she heard Su Li's words, but she quickly calmed down and said loudly, Feng Qingru is here. You can give Su Li a test. Feng Qingru? Su Li's pupil shrank, and she turned around. She saw a young woman in a fiery red dress stood up. She had a beautiful face and a pair of slanted eyes, which made her very charming. At this moment, Feng Qingru looked at Su Li with a little dissatisfaction because she was also a genius embroidery artificer. She said loudly, Su Li, since you can stand here and ask to test embroidery skills, you must be a top embroidery artificer. Every top embroidery artificer has advanced embroidery skills that she is good at. Why don't you show me your advanced embroidery skills? Hearing this, many embroidery artificers were surprised and couldn't help whispering. The difficulty of the embroidery lecturer's test was far less than what Feng Qingru said. The advanced embroidery skills were too difficult, and not every top embroidery artificer could master them. More senior embroidery artificers became top embroidery artificers by practicing their skills and practicing their skills. Feng Qingru became a top embroidery artificer at such a young age because of her advanced embroidery skills. However, Su Li was too young. Even if she knew the advanced embroidery skills, she couldn't reach the standard of the test. If she showed them, she probably couldn't pass the test. Su Li smiled bitterly. She was facing the master who taught her the embroidery skills in the last life. But in this life, they met here and inexplicably became rivals. The fate after her rebirth really made her speechless. Qingru, don't make trouble. Wenruomin couldn't help but scold her with a stern face. Before she finished her words, she heard Su Li's voice, I accept Lecturer Feng's test. Hearing this, all the lecturers, including Qingning, were stunned. Qingning even showed a little anxiety on her face. She remembered that in the Muyang Girls' School, Su Li showed that her basic embroidery skills reached the standard of a top embroidery artificer. Why couldn't she be provoked and directly agreed? Her father praised Su Li for being calm and not impulsive. She was really angry. You accept? Wenruomin was also a little unhappy. She thought that Su Li was too arrogant. This time, she could make Su Li suffer. She said, in this case, arrange it. Put on the embroidery board. As soon as Wenruomin finished her words, 2 manservants immediately came up and put the embroidery board in front of Su Li. At the same time, they handed the needlework box. Su Li threaded the needle and looked focused. She seemed to hear Feng Qingru's gentle exhortations in the previous life. Feng Qingru taught her the skill of the threaded flower needle. At that time, Feng Qingru was in her 30s and was already the first embroidery artificer in the Qinghe province. Now, she wanted to show Feng Qingru's excellent embroidery skills in the previous life to Feng Qingru, who was in her early 20s. Thinking of this, Su Li's eyes were clear. She pricked the first needle, the second needle. Her needling skills were getting faster and faster. She was very clear about what she wanted to do. The whole room was quiet for fear of affecting Su Li's embroidery. Seeing Su Li's fast needling skills, the embroidery artificer couldn't help but shake her head slightly. The advanced embroidery skill was not the basic embroidery skill. She needed to consider every stitch. If she made a mistake, she couldn't make up for it. This was also the most prominent difficulty of the advanced embroidery skill. Su Li's first performance had violated a big taboo. Feng Qingru snorted in her heart. Su Li was still a little girl with an impatient temper. How could the advanced embroidery skill be like this? She had thought that there was a rival in the school, but she didn't expect that she was an idiot. What? Suddenly, Feng Qingru's pupils shrank and she was shocked. She saw Su Li's wrist shake. That rhythm. Her hand shook. She's finished. Many senior embroidery artificers who didn't see through it felt pity. They hadn't seen any advanced tactical matrix of Han embroidery needed to shake the wrist. Su Li must have made a mistake. If there was a mistake in the advanced tactical matrix, how could she continue? Well, stop. What are you embroidering for? In the crowd, a middle-aged woman shouted impatiently. Her voice was extremely harsh. Su Li was suddenly disturbed. Her fingers trembled violently. She pricked her fingertip and a drop of blood came out. She breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, she didn't stab the needle. Because of the disturbance just now, her needle deviated. If she pricked it, she would lose everything. When the middle-aged woman saw Su Li pricked her finger, she laughed in her heart. Su Li couldn't help being frightened. When she was about to reprimand Su Li with her identity, she suddenly heard a thunderous shout. Wu Shuqin, what are you doing? Chapter 79. What can I do? Wu Shuqin finally reacted from the shock. She glared at Feng Qingru and said, Feng Qingru, don't think that you can yell at me because you are a genius embroidery artificer. Do you want us to wait for the rubbish embroidered by Su Li? Why are you yelling at me? Even Wu Shuqin said so about Su Li. Those senior lecturers who had not reached the top embroidery artificer could not help but nod and echo. Lecturer Wu is right. Since Su Li embroidered wrongly, she should stop. I also want to stop for a long time. The scene suddenly became chaotic. When Ruamin saw that the situation was not good, she snorted and drowned out the noise. She said slowly, be quiet. How can you behave like this? Wu Shuqin, I'm in charge of the test today. I didn't say anything. Why are you yelling? Could it be that you've taken a fancy to this old body seat and want to sit here as well? When Ruamin's voice was slow and peaceful, but it gave out infinite pressure, Wu Shuqin immediately broke into a cold sweat. She lowered her head and said, Dean, I didn't mean that. I am a little too anxious. I am also thinking for everyone. Since Su Li can't pass the test, why should we continue to waste time? Seeing that Wu Shuqin was still self-confident, Feng Qingru immediately laughed out of anger. She pointed at Su Li and snorted coldly, Wu Shuqin, open your eyes and look. If this is called rubbish, what you embroidered is a pile of shit. Qingru. When Ruamin snorted slightly and her eyes were slightly stern, she said, as a teacher, how can you even say such dirty words? Go back and copy the Book of Rites 300 times and give it to me in 3 days. Feng Qingru was scolded by Wen Ruamin. She calmed down and said, yes, Qingru, but Su Li's embroidery skills are actually better than mine. All the embroidery artificers here are not qualified to judge what she embroidered. Can you take Su Li's work to Miss Gong to have a look? Hearing that, all the people present were shocked. Didn't Feng Qingru provoke Su Li before? Why did she change her temper and speak for Su Li now? Feng Qingru, what nonsense are you talking about? Wu Shuqin jumped up like a cat whose tail was stepped on. She looked terrible and said, Su Li has obviously made a mistake and is not qualified to be an embroidery lecturer. Why did you ask the dean to give that kind of thing to Teacher Gong? What are your intentions? She had been displeased with Feng Qingru for a long time. This girl thought highly of herself and looked down upon embroidery artificers who were trained in ordinary needlework. Now she even openly targeted her. She didn't even have the qualification to give the embroidery to Miss Gong. If Wen Ruamin really sent Su Li's work to Miss Gong, Wen Ruamin wouldn't give it to Miss Gong. Where would she put her face? Hee, some people don't have any other abilities, but their ability to be envious of the talented and capable is top-notch. Feng Qingru sneered. She quickly walked down from her seat and came to Su Li. She looked at Su Li holding her right hand, and the red on her fingertip had dried up. She couldn't help but feel a little sorry. If she hadn't looked down on Suli at the beginning, Suli wouldn't have been misunderstood by Wu Shuqin and others. But there were too many people present. Feng Qingru couldn't say the 3 words after a long time. Seeing this, Suli smiled slightly. She opened the embroidery board, cut off the thread, and took off the needle. Then she gently handed the embroidery, which was only a small part, to Feng Qingru. There was even a trace of friendliness in Suli's peaceful smile. Feng Qingru felt ashamed. She took the embroidery carefully and put it in front of Wen Ruomin. Although Wen Ruomin's embroidery level was average, she had good eyesight under the influence of her good friend. She could see at a glance that Suli's embroidery skill was extraordinary. Is this the string flower needle? Wen Ruomin's eyes brightened, and her face showed a happy expression. She couldn't see much, but she knew that Suli's advanced needlework was better than Feng Qingru's. She could see that Suli's needlework was neat and tidy, and the whole pattern was smooth and lifelike. Moreover, Suli's speed before showed that Suli was better than Feng Qingru in advanced needlework. With this ability, Suli deserved to be the top embroidery artificer. Good. When Ruomin couldn't help but stand up excitedly and exclaim, I didn't expect that Ning Qing picked up a treasure for our school. Suli, would you like to be the embroidery lecturer? Suli quickly stood up and nodded. Of course I would. Seeing the result, Wu Shuqin was stunned and didn't know what to do. According to Wen Ruomin's temperament, it was absolutely impossible for her to play favoritism. That was to say, that embroidery was really not rubbish. It was her eyesight that was too poor. The embroidery lecturers around felt itchy and couldn't help but leave their seats to watch. Soon, Wen Ruomin was surrounded by 3 circles inside and 3 circles outside. Then, there was a burst of exclamation. This embroidery skill. I don't quite understand it. It's very powerful. How can she draw the feet in such an angle? It's amazing. Unfortunately, there is only a small part of the picture. Is it a river? It gives me a feeling of sparkling water. If Wu Shuqin didn't stop it, we could see the whole picture. Unfortunately, yes, many people couldn't help but beat their chests and stamp their feet. Many of them followed Wu Shuqin to crusade against Suli just now. Now they changed sides and joined the team to blame Wu Shuqin. Wu Shuqin stood still with a livid face. She opened her mouth and didn't know what to say. She also wanted to see it, but her feet seemed to be nailed to the ground. She couldn't move. Well, don't gossip. After all, they were both lecturers. Wen Ruomin didn't want to embarrass Wu Shuqin too much. She put away Suli's embroidery and stood up with a smile. Suli, I'm afraid that you have to live in the temporary yard for a day. After the judgment of Deputy Dean Gong comes out, I can arrange your lecturer level. After saying that, Wen Ruomin asked the crowd to disperse and left from the side door with her walking stick. After Suli saw Wen Ruomin leave, she turned around and left. But she didn't notice that the room was too quiet. Seeing Suli's figure disappear at the door, Feng Qingru suddenly gritted her teeth and strode to catch up with her. After the two of them left, a long time passed before the discussion in the room exploded like thunder. Oh my God! What did Dean Wen say just now? Is there something wrong with my ears? No one in the Girls' College of Literature has been a second-class lecturer for decades. Doesn't it mean that Suli is not only the youngest lecturer in the college, but also the youngest second-class lecturer? Hiss! Hearing these discussions, Wu Shuqin felt more and more ashamed. She left quickly. She was quite embarrassed, which made many people laugh secretly. Suli, wait for me. On the flagstone path, Suli heard a shout behind her. She stopped and looked back. Suddenly, she saw Feng Qingru catch up with her. Her heart couldn't help but tremble slightly. Suli, you walk so fast. Feng Qingru ran over and approached. Seeing Suli's calm expression, she suddenly felt a little embarrassed. She didn't know where to put her hands. After a long time, she whispered shyly, I'm really sorry for what happened just now. Looking at Feng Qingru's young face, Suli smiled and shook her head. Lecturer Feng didn't do anything wrong. Suli should thank you for your protection just now. No. Feng Qingru quickly waved her hand and blushed. I also made a mistake just now. A mistake is a mistake. There is nothing to cover up. Suli felt helpless and said, Well, I accept your apology. Do you have anything else to do with me? Feng Qingru's smile froze. She rolled her eyes and looked around. Seeing that there was no one around, she held Su Li's hand with one hand and said, "Are you going back? Let's talk on the way. By the way, you still don't know that the lecturers of the girls' school are also divided into levels." Su Li nodded and said, "I noticed what Dinwen said just now." Other people were very surprised. "Is there any mystery in it?" "It turns out that you saw it." Feng Qingru smiled brightly. At this age, she was lively and cheerful, which was almost different from the steady person in the previous life. The college pays attention to teaching students in accordance with their aptitude. The level of students is different, so the lecturers assigned are naturally different. Generally, the level of lecturers who just enter the college is limited. They are all third-class lecturers. When their teaching level is improved and they are assessed again, they will be promoted to the second class. And Su Li, you are very likely to be a second-class lecturer directly. Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows and said, "What are the benefits of being a second-class lecturer?" "There are a lot of benefits." Seeing that she aroused Su Li's interest, Feng Qingru immediately seized the opportunity and said, "For young lecturers like us, in addition to imparting skills, it is also very important for us to develop ourselves. Of course, the college will not ignore this. So, the higher the level, the more time we have and the fewer courses we arrange for us. Moreover, we can get a lot of commission for each lecture, and the share of lecturers that we can use is also high. We don't need to worry about the lack of money when we want to do research." Su Li listened and nodded repeatedly. This rule was very in line with the philosophy of the college. Of course, more importantly, it was very to her taste. After all, she came to the girls' school to teach by the way. Naturally, she hoped to have more time to read the precious classics of the girls' school. Then Feng Qingru chatted with Su Li all the way, and soon they arrived at the gate of the temporary yard. "I'm here. Thank you for seeing me off all the way." Su Li pointed to the door plate and turned back to say with a faint smile. Feng Qingru was slightly stunned. When did this road become so short? She hadn't thought about how to say it yet. "Su Li, Feng Qingru wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. She was so anxious that she was sweating. Finally, she plucked up her courage and said, "Su Li, in fact, I also learned the threaded flower needles." What a coincidence. Feng Qingru was about to cry when she said this. Su Li almost laughed out. Why didn't she find that Feng Qingru had such a lovely side in her previous life? That's really a coincidence. Su Li blinked her eyes playfully and said, "Thank you for protecting me today. In return, let's exchange embroidery boards in class and communicate more about embroidery in the future. How about that?" "Really?" Feng Qingru was so happy that she almost jumped up. She originally wanted Su Li to teach her the unique skills that she showed in the test just now, but she didn't say it because it was a little too shameless. However, she could also understand Su Li's embroidery board with her ability. She was very clear that her embroidery board was of no use to Su Li. Su Li said it was an exchange, but in fact, it was to teach her. Of course. Su Li smiled and nodded. Seeing Feng Qingru laugh happily, she also felt at peace from the bottom of her heart. Chapter 80. At this moment, when Ruamin walked slowly through a peach blossom forest with a crutch and stopped in front of a large courtyard with simple decoration. "Grandma won. Do you come to chat with Grandma again?" A girl in a white embroidered dress walked out quickly after hearing the sound. When she saw Wen Ruamin, a pair of pure eyes immediately showed surprise. She trotted over and supported Wen Ruamin. Wen Ruamin looked at the girl with loving eyes and could not help but nod slightly. "Min, how is your grandma recently?" "Thanks to you, Grandma is in good health. It's just that she is old and has blurred vision. It's not suitable for her to fight." When Ruamin could not help but feel relieved, it doesn't matter if she can't fight. She has a granddaughter like you, so she has a successor. "Grandma, you flatter me. I'm still far from being your granddaughter." Although Gong Min said so, her eyes were shining with joy. Obviously, she was very happy to be praised by Wen Ruamin. "Ruamin, why do you have time to come here?" An old woman's deep voice came from the study. Gong Min quickly stuck out her tongue and helped Wen Ruamin in. After making tea for the two old people, she stepped back. The old woman sitting in the study had white hair, and her face was covered with age spots. Obviously, she was older than Wenru Amin. At this moment, she held a scroll in her hand and looked far away from her eyes. No one knew what she was looking at. When Ruamin sat down and looked at the old woman, she could not help but sigh and said with a smile, Gong Xiangjuan, you are so old. Don't you know to take a break? Gong Xiangjuan put down the scroll and snorted. You still occupy the position of the dean and refuse to leave. How can you say that to me? Well, you say that every time you come here. I'm just 5 years older than you. I know my body. As long as you find someone to replace me, I won't go to class. I really have such an ideal candidate. When Ruamin smiled meaningfully and put a small half-piece of embroidery on the table, Gong Xiangjuan looked at it from a distance and then looked back at the book. He said, Qingru, her string flower needles are really good. She will be promoted to the first class in a year or two. But it's still early. Why do you take her embroidery? When Ruamin immediately laughed and shook her head, this is not embroidered by Feng Qingru. Look carefully. Gong Xiangjuan was startled after hearing that. Then she picked up the piece of embroidery and gently stroked it with her fingers. Her face immediately showed some surprise. Her hands had always been well-maintained, and they looked 10 years younger than her age. Although her eyesight was not good, she could basically tell the truth with just a touch. But this time, she couldn't get it. Strange, strange. Gong Xiangjuan muttered and opened the drawer on her left. She took out a pair of glass lenses and put it in front of her eyes. She put it close to the embroidery and observed it carefully. When Ruamin looked a little more serious, she was just joking. She didn't expect that Gong Xiangjuan would take out the glass pieces. These were special lenses made by the best craftsmen invited by Satrap Yen. With this, Gong Xiangjuan could still be active in the embroidery workshop at the age of 75. It could be said that the glass lens was Gong Xiangjuan's special treasure, and she would not easily show it in front of others. Time ticked by, and the tea turned cold. Gong Min came in to pour tea again. She saw the two old people staring at the small piece of embroidery in a daze. She was immediately curious, but she consciously did not disturb them. She refilled the tea and went out again. When the second cup of tea became cold, Gong Xiangjuan finally raised her head and said solemnly, I have never seen this kind of string flower stitch. It has a tendency to form a school of its own. If she can succeed, she may become the originator of a school. Ramin, where did you get this embroidery cloth? Is it the owner of the cloth who will replace me that you said? She is really qualified. When Ruamin opened her mouth, and she was extremely surprised in her heart. It was a joke, but it became true. She really didn't know what to say now. Which master was poached by you? Is it Meng Litong of Yuezhi province? Or LV Yashuan of Siki province? Tell me. Take me to see her. Seeing that when Ruamin didn't speak, Gong Xiangjuan suddenly became anxious. When Ruamin came to her sense and quickly comforted her, calm down, calm down. She won't run away. She is in the academy now. This embroidery was just embroidered. Why is it not complete? Gong Xiangjuan was relieved when she heard the words. Then she frowned and said, if an embroidery is not complete, it has no soul. With the strength she has displayed, there is no way she wouldn't know this. Well, there was an accident. When Ruamin braced herself to explain, Wu Shuqin seemed to make a big trouble. If she said it, according to Gong Xiangjuan's temper, she might immediately kick Wu Shuqin out of the academy. What accident? Gong Xiangjuan's face changed as expected. Someone dares to bully such a master? When Ruamin felt anxious and said with a wry smile, don't ask. I'll let her come to see you. It's not appropriate. Gong Xiangjuan immediately stood up and took the crutch beside her. Even if that person is a little younger than me, she can create a new school. Her attainments and embroidery skills are already equal to mine. How can I let her come to see me? It's unreasonable. I'm going to change clothes, and then you go to see her with me. You haven't told me who she is. Is it Meng Litong or LV Yashuan? Gong Xiangjuan's mouth was like a machine gun. When Ruamin suddenly collapsed and quickly let Gong Xiangjuan sit down, my old sister, just sit down. That little girl is only 15 years old. She is not a little younger than you. She is several generations younger than you. 15 years old. Gong Xiangjuan suddenly froze. After a long time, she murmured, "Are you kidding me?" After 10 minutes, Su Li stood in front of the quaint courtyard. Gong Min was curious, but she still maintained the courtesy. She nodded and said, "Grandma wants to see you. Come with me." Su Li followed Gong Min into the room and saw Wen Ruomin and Gong Xiangjuan at a glance. She calmed down and walked over to salute. Su Li, greetings, Dean Wan and Dean Gong." Gong Min wanted to stay and have a look, but when Ruomin signaled her with a look, she could only go out and close the door. Gong Xiangjuan saw Su Li's immature face and still couldn't believe her eyes. She picked up the embroidery cloth and asked, "Little girl, your name is Su Li, right? Is this embroidery cloth really embroidered by you?" Su Li nodded. Then she hesitated for a moment and said, "I still have some doubts. I don't know whether I should ask." When Ruomin immediately laughed and said, "I know what you want to ask. You may not have heard of Dean Gong. She has retired for many years and has been teaching in the college. Now half of the top embroidery artificers in the embroidery workshop in the Qinghe province are her students. Feng Qingru is her personal disciple. Do you know that?" Su Li's eyes flashed. Was this old lady Feng Qingru's teacher? She had heard of her in the previous life, but she had never seen her, because when she met Feng Qingru, Gong Xiangjuan had passed away. Feng Qingru always said that she hadn't seen her teacher for the last time. Because Gong Xiangjuan suddenly contracted a bad disease and died too fast, Feng Qingru was abroad at that time and had no time to come back. Remembering this memory, Su Li looked at Gong Xiangjuan calmly. As expected, she found that Gong Xiangjuan was a little gloomy, but she didn't feel her pulse, so her judgment was not accurate enough. Gong Xiangjuan quickly stood up and interrupted Wen Ruomin. "Why do you say this? Shameful." Then she touched the embroidery in her hand and sighed. "The new generation excels the old. Your embroidery skill foundation is extremely solid. I am afraid that you have worked hard. Just from the flatness of the embroidery, I can see that your basic needlework has also reached the level of the top embroidery artificer. The string flower needle is an extremely difficult embroidery technique in Han embroidery. You actually managed to innovate on it. You've really broadened my horizons. I can die without regrets now that I've seen this in my lifetime." Xiangjuan, hearing her old friend suddenly said so, when Ruomin couldn't help but worry. Gong Xiangjuan waved her hand and smiled. "I'm fine. I just said it out of feelings." Then she turned around and said, "Su Li, would you like to take over my position and teach the special class?" Even Su Li, who was steady, was stunned for a moment when she heard this. Special class? What was that? She saw from the booklet that there were only senior and junior classes. When Ruomin was also shocked and quickly stopped her. "Xiangjuan, you can't do this. Su Li is too young. I'm afraid that it's difficult to convince others." Gong Xiangjuan waved her hand and said, "Don't be afraid. How can I take back what I said? Besides, that group of little girls were all very arrogant, and it was time for someone to rub their spirit down a notch. Su Li, would you like to do that?" Looking at Gong Xiangjuan's smiling face, Su Li was silent for a moment, but she didn't nod. Instead, she asked, "Deans, I want to ask you something. If I take over the special class, how much free time can I have to read? I heard that the classics of the Qinghe Girls' School are very good." Hearing Su Li's words, the two old people were instantly stunned. If anyone else heard Gong Xiangjuan's words, they would definitely be overjoyed and moved to tears of gratitude. It was not an exaggeration to regard Gong Xiangjuan as a second parent, but Su Li actually hesitated to accept it. After being stunned for a long time, Gong Xiangjuan suddenly laughed out loud. When Ruomin also covered her face and smiled bitterly. "Ha ha ha. Su Li, you really don't know what the special class represents?" Su Li said helplessly, "I just arrived at the Qinghe province yesterday. Girl, you don't have to worry about it at all." Being refused by Su Li once, Gong Xiangjuan was in a surprisingly good mood. There are only 5 students in the special class. Those little girls don't have much time in the college. Generally, there is only 1 class in 7 days. You have a lot of time to hang out in the girls' school. Besides, the treatment of the special class lecturer is high. Su Li didn't pay much attention to the latter part. It couldn't be better that there was only 1 class in 7 days. In this way, she could spend more time on herself and wouldn't delay her practice in refining medicine. It was really excellent. Besides, the salary of the special class lecturer, Gong Xiangjuan, was still talking hard. When Ruomin couldn't help but interrupt, okay, say something else. She could see that Su Li was absent-minded. Except for time, this girl was not interested in anything else. Gong Xiangjuan stopped talking happily and was not angry. She looked at Su Li's eyes and liked her very much. It was really a great joy in life to see such an excellent junior in her later years. When Ruomin also sighed with emotion, Su Li reminded her of a person. Although that person was not as amazing as Su Li, she was also a descendant of a poor family. But later she heard that the girl died early and left nothing, which was really sad. After an hour, Su Li left the courtyard with a golden badge in her hand. The residence of the special class lecturer. You can choose any courtyard in the mountain, big or small. You can't live in the advanced courtyard, let alone the special class courtyard. In addition to old women like us, there are only a group of old guys in the College of Martial Arts. You are also a lecturer, so you don't have to be afraid of them. Thinking of what when Ruomin said, Su Li walked away, leaving the girl in white with a dull face. Chapter 81. Back to the courtyard, Su Li immediately asked Mammy Li to pack things. Mammy Li suddenly panicked and said, Miss, where are we going? Today's test. Seeing Mammy Li's appearance, Su Li nodded with a smile and said, Hurry up. We will move to the lecturer's courtyard today. Miss passed. Mammy Li was overjoyed. She immediately agreed and went to the room to pack up quickly. Because Mammy Li knew it was a temporary courtyard, she didn't unpack all the things. It was easy to pack them up. Not long after, two quick-witted young manservants pushed a small cart and stopped outside the door. Lecturer Su, my name is Xiaowu, and he is Datian. We will be your servants and be responsible for cleaning your courtyard. Mammy Li only needs to take care of the lecturer's daily life. The young man named Xiaowu looked at Su Li, who was the same age as them. He felt complicated, but he didn't dare to show any disrespect. They finally got into the school and got the position that everyone in the village envied. They couldn't lose it. Su Li smiled and nodded. Mammy Li, have you packed your things? Yes. Mammy Li struggled to come out with big and small bags. When she saw the two teenagers in plain clothes at the door, she was stunned for a moment. Then she immediately reacted and said in a gentle voice, Thank you for your help. Otherwise, I have to carry the things with the miss. Don't mention it. Xiaowu and Datian were both frightened. They quickly took the bags and carefully put them on the wooden cart. Manservants like them were the lowest servants of the school. No one would say thank you to them. Mammy Li was not surprised. The Qinghe girls' school was the same as before. Many years ago, she was also a maid here. A group of people quickly went up the mountain. Su Li walked in the front. They turned left and right along the flat stone road. The deeper they went, the clearer the air became. The buildings were more and more luxurious. Mammy Li was frightened and couldn't help but pull Su Li's sleeve. Miss, are we going to the wrong place? Only special class lecturers are qualified to live here. You are a third-class lecturer at most, and your residence is at the foot of the mountain. Su Li's eyes flickered slightly when she heard the words. Xiaowu and Datian were also panicked. They had never been here and doubted that the lecturer, who looked too young, led them the wrong way. Su Li didn't answer Mammy Li's words. Instead, she pointed forward and said, Follow me. It's just ahead. With that, she took the lead and walked over. Mammy Li felt bitter and could only keep up quickly. Finally, Su Li stopped in a medium-sized house. The walls of the whole courtyard were carved with bluish-gray rocks, and there were reliefs of strange beasts on them. Tall trees poked their heads out of the courtyard wall. They were verdant and lush, cutting the sunlight into pieces and projecting it onto the wall. One could vaguely smell the sweet osmanthus fragrance of the evening osmanthus. Su Li looked around again. She could hardly see other courtyards with the naked eye. It was very quiet. This is it. Su Li directly pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked in. Miss, we can't live here. Mammy Li wailed and immediately caught up with her. Xiaowu and Datian had no choice but to follow him. Inside the courtyard, the layout was more exquisite. The whole two-story attic was made of mahogany, and the furniture was camphor wood, exuding a refreshing fragrance. Suli went up to the second floor and opened the window. She could see the rockery and flower pond downstairs. The branches were orderly. There were withered lotus leaves on the surface of the pond. If it was summer, there would be lotus flowers everywhere, and the fragrance would fill the room. Of course, these were just the appearance for Suli. More importantly, the nimbus here was relatively rich. She observed along the way and found that many good places had been occupied. Finally, she could only choose the second place. If I can find the starwood, I can slightly transform it. But I practice by myself and configure enough elixirs. The geographical advantage will be left to fate. Suli thought so and went downstairs. At this moment, Mammy Lee was restless downstairs, for fear that someone would come in at this time and punish them. Xiaowu and Datian were even more pale, and their legs were trembling. Seeing this scene, Suli shook her head. She didn't want to say it, but she was afraid of leaking the news in advance. Although she knew that the news that she became a special class lecturer would be spread out sooner or later, she still hoped that the present peace could last for a few more days. Of course, compared with the trouble of giving a lesson every 7 days, Suli still felt that the latter was more attractive. "Mammy, clean up the room." Suli gently took out a golden badge and put it on the table. Then she said to Xiaowu and Datian, "You two go to clean the courtyard." Although the courtyard has been cleaned regularly, there are still too many weeds. When Mammy Lee saw the golden badge, she was puzzled at first. Then she suddenly thought of something, and her eyes showed extreme shock and horror. "Mississippi, how did you get this thing? Give it back." Mammy Lee pointed at the badge, as if she had seen a ghost. She recognized what it was. Seeing Mammy Lee's reaction, Su Lee's eyes became deeper. She turned over the back of the badge and said, "How could I steal it? Do you think that your miss is stupid and brings you here regardless of anything?" Seeing the two bright words, Su Lee, on the back of the badge, Mammy Lee was completely stunned. At this moment, it seemed that the two words, Su Lee, turned into an electric current from the top of her head, flowed through her whole body, and slipped away from the soles of her feet. Half of her body was numb. How could the miss become a special class lecturer after one day? That was a special class lecturer. There were no more than 10 people in the entire Qinghe school. And how many lecturers were there in the Qinghe school? There were nearly 80 female students in the College of Arts, not to mention the other 4 colleges. Was she dreaming? Mammy Lee pinched her face fiercely. The next moment, she uttered a very pleasant scream. "Ouch, it hurts. Miss, I'm going to clean up now." After receiving the message, Mammy Lee's face immediately turned red, and she walked like the wind. Xiaowu and Datian were stunned. "Brother, you are experienced and knowledgeable. What is that badge?" Datian couldn't help but ask. Xiaowu suddenly had a toothache. He didn't know it, but in order to be pretentious in front of his brother, he immediately said, "Stupid. You don't even know it. Lecturer Su lives in such a luxurious place. Of course, she is a first-class lecturer. I don't think she looks like one." Before Datian finished his words, his head was flicked by Xiaowu. He said, "Doesn't look like one? Bullshit. We can't inquire about these things. Hurry up and clean up the courtyard with me." In the next few days, the entire Qinghe Girls' School was unusually quiet. Mei Ruhan successfully became a third-class student of the Qinghe Girls' School by her own ability. At her age, she was outstanding in the Muyang town. But when she came to the Qinghe province, she found that she was just one of the ordinary peers, not even outstanding. It was the first time that Mei Ruhan had such a feeling. She felt lost, but she was more motivated. It was a good thing to have a goal. In those years in Muyang town, she had no direction, so her progress slowed down. "I don't know how Suli is. I haven't heard about her courses these days. I want to go and listen to them." Mei Ruhan held the black cover of the Dictionary of Dahan and couldn't help muttering in her heart. In addition to Mei Ruhan, Ning Qing, Feng Qingru, and Wu Shuqin also inquired about the final results secretly. But no matter how they inquired, Suli seemed to disappear completely. The college didn't arrange courses, and no one knew where she lived. "What's the matter? We can't even find her. Doesn't she need to attend classes? Wu Shuqin was almost suffocated, but she didn't dare to ask when Ruamin. She could only continue to inquire secretly. Dad, why don't you ask where Su Li is now? In the courtyard, Ning Qing couldn't help but complain. In the past 2 days, she searched all the third-class and second-class courtyards, but she couldn't find Su Li. As a second-class lecturer, she couldn't enter the first-class courtyard, which was really uncomfortable. Ning Yunji laughed and said aloud, "You don't need to look for her. That girl was doing well now. She went to soak in it every day. Of course, you can't find her." What class is she? There are no classes arranged in the college these days. Ning Qing was slightly shocked. It had been 3 days. There were no classes for 3 days. Was she really a first-class lecturer? It should be known that the second-class lecturer had to give at least 2 classes in 3 days. Su Li didn't come to teach, which could explain the problem. Ning Yunji shook his head and said, "You will know it later. Don't ask more now." So as not to make trouble for Su Li, Ning Qing felt her scalp numb. Her father's attitude was not first class. Could it be? She didn't dare to think more and turned to leave. If what she thought was true, when the news spread, Su Li would inevitably cause a stir in the college. No wonder her father didn't tell her a word. On the other side, Feng Qingru found Gong Xiangjuan and then left with a face of shock and joy. She didn't expect that Su Li's embroidery level was much better than what she saw. On the 6th day, all the embroidery lecturers of the girls' school began to be impetuous. They didn't even see Su Li in the past 6 days. Su Li? Was she directly driven out of the school because of the embroidery that Dean Gong criticized as worthless? I even searched all the courtyards of the first-class lecturers, but I didn't find her. In the past 2 days, her name was not in the class schedule. Sure enough, she is just a person with a false reputation. A 15-year-old top embroidery artificer is too fake. The last sentence was uttered by Wu Shuqin solemnly and solemnly. In the past few days, her heart was in turmoil. It could be said that she had experienced a roller coaster experience. Fortunately, she won in the end. When Feng Qingru and Ning Qing heard Wu Shuqin's words, they smiled at the same time. Then they tacitly didn't tell Wu Shuqin the truth. They were looking forward to Wu Shuqin's expression tomorrow. In the evening of the 7th day, after the class, Wu Shuqin came to the class schedule with her classmates as usual and waited. The Qinghe Girls' School had a huge manpower cooperation. The time of each lecturer was not fixed. So, the daily classes were arranged temporarily and released in the evening. Wu Shuqin and others were waiting for the class schedule tomorrow. By the way, Shuqin, you are about to pass the second-class lecturer qualification. You don't have to work hard in class every day. I envy you. Congratulations, Shuqin. Hearing the compliments of the lecturers around her, Wu Shuqin smiled and thanked them again and again. At her age, she had enough experience. Passing the assessment and becoming a second-class lecturer was her reward. It was almost a done deal. She was almost 40 years old now and couldn't stand the tiredness of attending classes every day. A group of people walked to the class schedule. As soon as Wu Shuqin appeared, she was immediately stared at by countless eyes. She had experienced this kind of situation only in the course test. It was the second time today. Is it the result of my assessment of the second-class lecturer? Wu Shuqin was happy and immediately quickened her steps to the front of the crowd. In fact, she didn't need to squeeze. When she went forward to see the class schedule, everyone automatically made way for her. Those expressions were full of indescribable weirdness. Unfortunately, Wu Shuqin was too happy to notice it. Chapter 82. Special First Class, Embroidery. Lecturer, Su Li. Wu Shuqin's smile froze on her face instantly. The bright red characters were magnified in her eyes like a nightmare. How could Su Li become a special class lecturer? There was only 1.5 in the special class, and Dean Gong had always been in charge of it. Was Su Li just another person with the same name? Wu Shuqin kept trying to convince herself, but her face became paler and paler. When Ruamin took Su Li's embroidery to the special class a few days ago. Today, the lecturer of the special class changed. Su Li couldn't be someone else. She is only 15 years old. Is there a mistake? Wu Shuqin's lips trembled violently. It seemed that she had severely offended Su Li in the test that day. Now, with Su Li's power, if she cast a negative vote on her assessment, then, thinking of this, Wu Shuqin couldn't help but feel dizzy. Su Li is coming. It's Su Li. At this moment, the crowd burst into an uproar, and then neatly separated to make a way. A girl in a plain white dress came calmly with a quaint file in her hands. Her eyebrows were curved, and a pair of pure black pupils were reflected under her thick and curly eyelashes, like the moonless, starry sky. Her nose was small and tall, which set off the perfect side face. Her hair was casually spread behind her like splashed ink. There was only a simple green hairpin in her hair bun, but it was amazing. She was like a woman coming out of a painting, infinitely beautiful. What a beautiful girl! Many lecturers who saw Su Li for the first time exclaimed, "If I can have such a beautiful daughter, even if she is an idiot, I will accept her." Is she Su Li? She is a special class lecturer of the girls' school at the age of 15, and she is so beautiful? For a moment, many female lecturers who imagined Su Li was a talented but not beautiful female lecturer were all stunned. Was she the daughter of God? Su Li walked to the lesson board and saw her courses. She couldn't help but frown when she glanced back and saw dozens of eyes. She heard that Xiaowu had a class today, so she came to have a look. She didn't expect that so many people were waiting for her here. Su Li, where have you been these days? I can't find you. Feng Qingru came over and said with envy, "Congratulations. I have heard it from the teacher." Su Li pursed her lips slightly and showed a cordial expression. She whispered, "There are too many people here. Let's talk about it in detail when you go to my place." Feng Qingru's eyes brightened, and she nodded repeatedly. "Su Li, congratulations." Ning Qing walked over with a look of amazement. Her attitude was completely different from 7 days ago. She didn't expect that the young girl that her father tried so hard to protect would actually be so talented that even Dean Gong was willing to give up his position. She was also a little scared because if it wasn't for her father's insistence, she would never have agreed to it. Now that he thought about it, if Su Li really stayed in the Desu town for a lifetime, it would be a real pearl covered with dust. Now that she came to a bigger stage, this pearl finally bloomed the brilliance she deserved. Su was Qing said, Li, and teacher at the Ming. Shan, Ming. Ning Qing was even starting to believe that some of her father's nonsense might be true. Seeing Ning Qing, Su Li's face was full of gratitude. "Thanks to the help of you and Elder Master, I have been familiar with the affairs of the academy these days. After class tomorrow, I will come to thank you." Ning Qing had a better impression of Su Li. She nodded with a smile and said, "Well, I will pour a pot of new tea for you." After they finished talking, many people wanted to say a few words to Su Li, but they couldn't find a chance. They could only watch Su Li and Feng Qingru leave. From beginning to end, Su Li didn't look at Wu Shuqin. Wu Shuqin stood aside like a puppet. Her face was pale, but she was relieved in her heart. Yes, Su Li was already a special class lecturer. How could she deal with a nobody like her? She didn't even want to embarrass her in the second-class lecturer's assessment, which was not in line with her identity and self-restraint. Wu Shuqin felt that she had escaped a disaster, but she was not happy. She looked at Su Li with more hatred. "Su Li, don't think that you can sit back and relax after you become a special class lecturer. Those students in the special class are not so easy to deal with." Wu Shuqin said with hatred and left with a long face. Those lecturers who congratulated her before all avoided her as if they saw a plague. Many people knew that she offended Su Li. Su Li couldn't do anything, but it didn't mean that others couldn't. Su Li came to the house with Feng Qingru. Feng Qingru couldn't help but envy Su Li when she saw such a quiet and exquisite courtyard. The treatment of a special class lecturer was really good. "By the way, Su Li, when will you go to the embroidery workshop?" Feng Qingru couldn't help but ask after visiting. Su Li kept pouring tea and said lightly, "Why should I go there? I am not a worker of the embroidery workshop." Even in the previous life, Su Li was not a formal worker of the embroidery workshop in the Qinghe town. Although her embroidery skills were good enough, she didn't get the corresponding title because of various obstacles. So, Her treatment was much worse than that of other embroidery artificers. Feng Qingru couldn't help but be stunned. She felt strange and said, "Really? You took over the teacher's position and became the only special class embroidery lecturer in the Qinghe Girls' School. Naturally, you became the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop. Didn't the teacher tell you that?" Suli was really confused. She raised her head and looked confused. She remembered that she was absent-minded in front of Gong Xiangjuan that day. There seemed to be such a sentence. Seeing Su Li's expression, Feng Qingru suddenly burst into laughter and said, "You have been the workshop owner for 7 days, but you haven't seen it even once." All the embroidery artificers in the embroidery workshop were scared and shivered. "I thought they did something to make you unhappy. It turns out that you didn't know it. Haha, it's so funny." A few black lines appeared on Su Li's forehead. Gong Xiangjuan did it thoroughly. She not only gave her the special class lecturer position, but also gave her the embroidery workshop. The special class lecturer was quite free, but the embroidery workshop was not so good. For a moment, Su Li didn't know whether she made a profit or was cheated. "Why? It seems that you are not willing to be the workshop owner?" Seeing Su Li's depressed expression, Feng Qingru said angrily, "If other embroidery artificers in the embroidery workshop see this, they will definitely be annoyed by you. Do you know what the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop represents?" Su Li handed over the teacup and sighed with emotion. That position represents the first embroidery artificer in the Qinghe province. Regardless of power and status, it is even comparable to the satrap. Senior Gong really thinks highly of me. It turns out that you know it. Feng Qingru opened her beautiful eyes slightly and said, "Then why are you still unwilling?" Su Li smiled and shook her head slightly. "It's not that I am unwilling, but that I can't afford it. There are so many people from aristocratic families in the embroidery workshop. I am afraid that it will be troublesome for me to be the workshop owner." "It doesn't matter." Feng Qingru was full of confidence. "With your embroidery skills, you can be the workshop owner. It is enough to convince people. The teacher will also support you behind your back. No one will say anything. I see that the teacher usually does nothing. Only when the embroidery workshop receives difficult orders, she will ask the workshop owner to take action. Besides, you can take 10% of the embroidery workshop's income. Every year, you can go to Yunjing to participate in the county embroidery conference. There are so many advantages. Don't waste it." Feng Qingru said that many workshop owners had power. Su Li was more and more surprised. Why did Gong Xiangjuan let her manage such an important position like a child's play? What on earth did she do? Or, she knew that she would die soon, so she took the gamble? Su Li's eyes were deep. Looking at Feng Qingru, who was cheerful and totally different from the person in the previous life, Su Li faintly felt that something extraordinary would happen in these years, which caused Feng Qingru's temperament to change greatly, and she would become the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop. Well, I will help her clear some obstacles before that. Su Li completely calmed down after this thought flashed through her mind. She said, "I will go and have a look the day after tomorrow. I have to meet an old senior tomorrow. I don't know how long it will take." Su Li's sudden calmness surprised Feng Qingru, but she was also happy for Su Li when she heard that Su Li was no longer entangled. She repeatedly asked Su Li to keep the embroidery board for class and then left. "Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh, miss, it's windy. Go into the room quickly. Don't catch a cold." Su Li said nothing and stepped to the second floor. Looking at the crazy swaying trees in the courtyard, she sighed in her heart. It was clear that a storm was coming. The news spread among the lecturers. That night, the news that a 15-year-old girl became a special class lecturer of the girls' school had spread throughout the Qinghe Girls' School. Even the men's school had heard about it. In the satrap's mansion, the girl in red was sweating. She picked up a dark steel bow beside her and easily pulled the string. Clang! An arrow broke through the air and hit the bullseye. Clap, clap, clap. The little girl standing on the side with a quiver suddenly applauded. "Miss, you are so awesome. You hit the bullseye again." Hearing that, the girl in red helplessly looked at the little girl and put down the longbow. Her eyes unconsciously drifted to another pure silver longbow. She hesitated for a long time and finally did not dare to take it. Her father said that only when she pulled the bow and hit the bullseye from 200 meters away could she be set free. But now she couldn't even pick up the bow. It was too difficult. Her father was obviously forcing her. "Miss, you should go to the school tomorrow. It's embroidery." The little maid came to remind her. The girl in red nodded carelessly and muttered, "I don't know what to learn." Mrs. Gu never learned embroidery, but she also became a female general. That old woman still insisted that I was wrong. Hearing that, the little maid immediately smiled and said, "Miss, you are wrong. I heard that the lecturer of the special first class has been changed. She is not Grandma Gong." Substitutions? The girl in red was surprised and immediately became nervous. "Is the old woman okay? Is there something wrong with her body? Why didn't my father tell me?" The little maid immediately laughed. Although the miss had a sharp tongue, she actually cared about Grandma Gong very much. "No, Grandma Gong thought she was too old and chose the lecturer herself. And I heard that the lecturer is only 15 years old, the same age as you." Hearing that, the girl in red slightly opened her beautiful eyes. "A 15-year-old lecturer? Is that old woman out of her mind?" The little maid stuck out her tongue. "Huan doesn't know. Miss, you will know when you see her tomorrow." Chapter 83. "Miss, it's time to go to school." The next morning, Xiaowu shouted outside the door. Yesterday, they knew that Su Li was not a first-class lecturer at all, but a more advanced special class lecturer. In the mouth of students, it was also called the special class. After getting the news, they were so excited that they didn't fall asleep at midnight. It turned out that they only thought they followed an ordinary lecturer because of Su Li's age. They didn't expect that she was a special class lecturer. When they thought that when the administrator of the school came to recruit, other manservants were unwilling to go, they couldn't help laughing. Su Li got up very early to practice. At this moment, when she heard the shout outside the door, she calmly put on the clothes of the special class lecturer and walked out empty-handed. Seeing a small carriage and Xiaowu waiting beside the carriage, she nodded slightly. The special class school was a little far, and her clothes were too ostentatious. It was better to sit in the carriage. After a while, the horse stopped with a neigh. Su Li got off the station and came to the special class school. Feng Qingru said that it was called Nuanfeng Pavilion. There was only one school. There were no walls on all sides, and all the windows could be used as walls. The structure was very delicate. It was made by Imo Jiama, the first craftsman in the Qinghe province. Su Li told Xiaowu to wait outside the courtyard. Then she opened the door and walked in. In the next moment, 4 people looked at her. Su Li calmly walked to the teacher's table and glanced at the 4 people under the table. She recognized one of them. It was Gong Min. Gong Min saw Su Li and nodded slightly to say hello. Su Li nodded gently and turned her head. The first thing that came into her sight was the girl in red like fire. It was not that other people were not good enough, but the girl in the red dress was in the acquired 6th hurdle. She could even be equal to Feng Yuan's cultivation. As for the other 2 girls who seemed to be 17 or 18 years old, they were ordinary people. The Qinghe town is really a place of crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Since there is a 15-year-old in the acquired 6th hurdle, there must be a senior in the inborn realm. I can't be careless. This thought flashed in Su Li's mind. She said loudly, "Nice to meet you. My name is Su Li. You must have heard of me. I will teach you embroidery from now on. Today, in the first class, I am not going to teach you anything, but to do a small test to test all of your embroidery level. Now, tell me your name. It is better if you can introduce yourself briefly." Su Li's words were simple and straightforward. A touch of appreciation flashed through the eyes of the girl in red. She said proudly, "Su Li, I heard that you are not from a good family, but I like your character very much. I will tell you that my name is Yin Hongxiu and I live in the satrap's mansion. Do you understand?" Yin Hongxiu said and curled her lips coldly. She looked at Su Li's reaction with a little sarcasm. How could such a silly girl be her teacher? The old woman was probably so confused that she couldn't think straight anymore. However, at this moment, an extremely cold and indifferent voice sounded. "Yin Hongxiu?" Su Li didn't seem to hear the latter half of the sentence and said lightly, Pay attention to your tone in the future and respect your teacher in class. Since you are sitting here, you should scrupulously abide by etiquette. Okay, next. Yin Hongxiu was dumbfounded. She guessed that Su Li would probably pretend to be calm and praise her. Or, she would forget herself and cover up her panic in a hurry. But she didn't expect that Su Li's reaction would be so ruthless. Yes, it was heartless. It seemed that Su Li didn't hear that she was the satrap's daughter. No, she heard it but didn't care. Seeing that Yin Hongxiu was scolded, the two misses from rich families were slightly surprised. They immediately dispelled their thoughts and said obediently, "My name is Ran Ziden. My family is a businessman and quite rich. My name is Dong Xiaoxian. Like Miss Ran, my family is also a businessman." Gong Min saw that Yin Hongxiu was embarrassed and couldn't help but laugh in her heart. Then she said loudly, "My name is Gong Min, Lecturer Su. Why don't you start the test?" Su Li heard it and shook her head slightly. She frowned and said, "Senior Gong said that there are 5 people in the special class. There are only 4 of you. Where is the other one?" Well, Ran Ziden and Dong Xiaoxian looked at each other and kept silent at the same time. Yin Hongxiu snorted coldly. Her expression clearly said that she wouldn't tell her even if she begged her. Gong Min said, "The other one is Jean Ruolin. She is the pearl of the Jean family in the provincial city. She usually comes on time. I don't know why today." "Jean Ruolin?" Su Li murmured. Then she sat down and said leisurely, "Nothing can be accomplished without rules. My teacher is also a teacher. As long as all the students are not present in his class, he won't start the class. As his student, I naturally follow this tradition. Do you have any opinion?" When the 4 people below the stage heard this, they were shocked. What kind of logic was this? "Lecturer, you are simply dragging down the progress of our course. It is unreasonable." Yin Hongxiu immediately stood up and said angrily, "Did she think that she was Grandma Gong? How could she put on such airs in the first class?" "Yin Hongxiu, are you blaming me?" Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows. She tilted her head and smiled. "Why do you blame me? Shouldn't the 4 of you blame Jean Ruolin? If it weren't for her, we could have started the course long ago. Your time is the time, but mine is. You are waiting for her, but so am I logically. Shouldn't the 5 of us blame Jean Ruolin?" Hearing Su Li's words, Yin Hongxiu was suddenly confused. Although she felt there was something strange in her words, she couldn't find any fault. Jean Ruolin. Yin Hongxiu's beautiful eyes flashed with anger. She hated Jean Ruolin very much in ordinary days. Jean Ruolin was like a fly around her every day. She also treated Grandma Gong the same way, which was extremely disgusting. The other 3 people were a little older. They knew that Su Li meant to divert the trouble to Jean Ruolin, but they couldn't help but feel a little disgusted with Jean Ruolin. In Su Li's words, Jean Ruolin obviously became a person without any sense of responsibility. "Huan." Yin Hongxiu couldn't help but call. Suddenly, a clear voice of a little girl came from outside the door. "Miss, I am here. Go and call Jean Ruolin. I want to see how arrogant she is. Even if I invite her, she won't come." Huan was shocked when she heard Yin Hongxiu was angry. She immediately obeyed and left. After an hour, a beautiful figure with a fragrant wind appeared in front of the door of the warm pavilion. It was quiet in the school, and the atmosphere was very dignified. Jean Ruolin coughed and walked in with small steps. She sat next to Yin Hongxiu and said with kindness and expectation, "Sister Hongxiu, why do you call me here?" Jean Ruolin was still surprised. She didn't expect that Yin Hongxiu would suddenly come to her. Was the relationship between her and Yin Hongxiu going further? This girl had always ignored her in the past. "Who is your sister?" Yin Hongxiu was annoyed when she heard Jean Ruolin's address. She said, "Do you know that there is a class today? Why don't you come?" Jean Ruolin's smile on her face was slightly stiff. She soon recovered and said, "Didn't you say that the lecturer was changed? She is still a little girl. I happened to have an important elder to receive at home, so I didn't come. But when I saw Huan, I immediately rushed over." Jean Ruolin's words were full of disdain. It seemed that she didn't see Su Li sitting at the teacher's desk and chatted with Yin Hongxiu as if nothing had happened. Yin Hongxiu instantly laughed out of anger and didn't know how to explain. But at this time, Suli said. You mean that you don't want to come as long as it is my class? Is that right, Jean Rulin? Jean Rulin stopped smiling and recovered the calm look of a lady from a respectable family. She turned around and said with a smile, Oh, I'm so sorry. Rulin, I didn't see Lecturer Sue here. I didn't mean that just now, but an important elder suddenly came to visit at home. So you mean, Suli said evilly, the special course of the Qinghe Girls' School is not as important as your elder? Jean Rulin's face was slightly pale. She waved her hand repeatedly and said, I didn't mean that. Then what do you mean? Huh? Do you look down on the lecturer of the Qinghe Girls' School? Suli suddenly raised her tone, and the pressure was greatly increased. Jean Rulin was so scared that she turned pale and almost cried. I was wrong, Lecturer Sue. I spoke rudely just now. Please punish me, lecturer. Jean Rulin knelt down and apologized again and again. She had wanted to take advantage of Suli verbally, but she didn't expect that she was defeated by Suli in a second. She didn't even know why she was afraid and why she lost. The other 4 people were also shocked. Jean Rulin was the pearl of the Jean family. How could she be scared by Suli's words? Yin Hongxiu was at a loss. It seemed that she didn't understand why Jean Rulin, who was arrogant just now, suddenly became like this. In this case, since it's your first offense, I won't pursue it anymore. Go back to your seat and start the test. Suli waved her sleeves. Jean Rulin immediately felt that she was pardoned. She sat back to her seat obediently, but her hands were slightly trembling. Suli noticed this detail and slightly raised the corner of her mouth. The Jean family, it was really a long time. The first test is to test the basic needlework. You are limited to embroider an osmanthus flower with basic needlework in half an hour. Suli said lightly, I will also join you. Let's get started. The 5 people slightly stared at the words. They didn't dare to delay and immediately began to embroider. This test was still a little difficult for them, but if they could perform exceptionally, they should be able to complete it. But they didn't know how long it would take Suli. The whole warm room became quiet. Only the action of threading the needle was repeated. Even the sound of opening the needle box became a little harsh. Gong Min was embroidering the 3rd petal attentively. Suddenly, a white and tender hand appeared in her eyes and gently held her hand. Try to change the angle of half an inch and embroider from here. Suli's voice slowly came into her ears. Gong Min was a little calm and immediately carried out Suli's order without hesitation. She was the only student who had seen Suli's embroidery. Naturally, she knew that Suli's embroidery skills were even better than her grandmother's. After changing the angle, Gong Min found that her arm was much more comfortable, and the petals seemed to become more flexible, not as rigid as before. Suli. Oh no, Lecturer Sue is really talented and knowledgeable, Gong Min secretly praised. Suddenly, she realized that Suli appeared beside her at this time. Did it mean? She couldn't help but look up. Sure enough, she saw that the embroidery board on the teacher's desk had been erected. There seemed to be an osmanthus flower just picked from the tree on it. Let's not talk about Gong Min's reaction. At this moment, Suli walked to Yin Hongxiu. When she saw what Yin Hongxiu was embroidering, she suddenly looked strange. What was this? Osmanthus flower? She looked like a ball of tofu dregs. Why is the needle so fragile? It's almost broken. It's so troublesome, Yin Hongxiu whispered with a bitter face. Suddenly, she noticed that there was a sound of breathing beside her. She immediately looked up and saw a pair of eyes full of indescribable feelings. Yin Hongxiu's little face immediately turned red. You are not allowed to see it. Yin Hongxiu hurriedly covered the embroidery board and said, Aren't you embroidering with us? What are you doing here? Do you want to learn secretly? Finally, she plucked up her courage and put it on the table. I won't run away anymore. Yin Hongxiu's eyes were full of fighting spirit as if she had changed into another person. Before long, the incense burner burned out. Half an hour had passed. Suli clapped her hands and motioned everyone to stop. Gong Min stopped and a trace of pity flashed in her eyes. She didn't embroider the last branch. However, with Su Li's guidance, she had a lot of inspiration in embroidering flowers with basic needlework today. It was enough for her embroidery skills to make a small step forward. Ran Ziden and Dong Xiaoxian didn't finish embroidering either. They still needed half a branch and 2 leaves. Compared with Gong Min, their embroidery skills were still a little worse. Jean Rulin put down the needle and thread at the same time, but her eyes were full of confidence. She was the first to present the embroidery board. She was the only one who finished embroidery. I didn't expect that even Gong Min didn't finish embroidery. Does it mean that my embroidery skills have surpassed hers and I have become the first in the class? Jean Rulin was complacent. She looked up and saw a pair of cold eyes. You finished embroidery. Do you think you are very good? Su Li's words were like cold water poured over her head. Jean Rulin suddenly woke up and shook her head quickly. Then she saw the embroidery on the embroidery board. Really? She couldn't help but grab it, but just like Yin Hongxiu, she grabbed nothing. It is embroidery. Jin Rulin was so shocked that she couldn't compare with Su Li anymore. The gap was too big at this time. The other 4 people also presented the embroidery boards in turn and waited for Su Li's comments. Su Li picked up Ran Ziden's embroidery board first. She glanced at it and said, "The basic skills are solid, but the stitches are still superficial. You need to carve the details well. The speed is not up to the standard of the top embroidery artificer, and the pattern is too rigid. It lacks authenticity. It's better to enjoy flowers in your spare time." Every word of Su Li hit the nail on the head. Ran Ziden was ashamed and couldn't help but have the true reverence for Su Li that only a teacher and a student had. Then it was Dong Xiaoxuan's turn. She naturally made a sharp comment. The third one was Yin Hongxiu's turn. She plucked up her courage and stood in front of Su Li. She was ready to be scolded, but Su Li just glanced at her lightly and said, "There is still room for improvement in embroidery skills. After class, take Gong Min's embroidery board back to practice." Yin Hongxiu waited for a long time, but she was stunned when she saw Su Li pick up Gong Min's embroidery board. That was it? Didn't she scold others? Yin Hongxiu stood aside with her embroidery board. She was still confused. Since she came to the special class, it was the first time for her to be so excited. Seeing Gong Min's embroidery board, Su Li finally smiled and said, "Very good. You are developing in the ideal direction. I have pointed out a direction for you. If you can use it to reach a higher realm, it will be the best." Gong Min took a deep breath and couldn't help but say excitedly, "Thank you, lecturer. I have been stuck for a long time. Grandma can't help it. I must tell her the good news later." Su Li smiled and nodded. Gong Min didn't take the embroidery board and stood aside. Jean Rulin took a deep breath. Finally, it was her turn. Gong Min didn't finish the embroidery, but she was praised. If she finished, then, at this time, the 5 people didn't notice. They didn't know when they began to care about Su Li's comments. In just one class, the relationship between Su Li and the 5 people completed an amazing change from peers to teachers and students. Su Li slowly picked up Jean Rulin's embroidery board and said, "The speed is good, and the stitches are smooth. It means a top embroidery artificer." Hearing this, Jean Rulin was happy, but Su Li's voice suddenly became cold. "However, you only focus on showing off your skills and completely ignore the essence of embroidery. Let me ask you, what is the highest realm that an embroidery artificer should pursue?" Jean Rulin was shocked and replied without thinking, "Of course, it is the top embroidery method like the workshop owner." "Advanced embroidery method? I heard that the lecturer knows how to use flower needle. Why don't you teach us?" "Oh." Su Li sneered and said, "Do you think the most important thing for an embroidery artificer is the status? Do you want to be an embroidery artificer just for fame and fortune?" "Of course not." Jean Rulin's face was livid. At this moment, she had recovered from the shock. Although she didn't understand why she was so scared just now, it didn't prevent her from refuting confidently, "The embroidery method of the workshop owner is naturally the best, and it is also what every embroidery artificer pursues. What's wrong with what I said? What if I ask you to put aside the embroidery workshop?" Su Li said lightly, "What else can you say?" Jean Rulin was dumbfounded. In addition to the skills and embroidery workshop that she had mastered, What else could she say? These two ways were blocked by Su Li. It seems that you don't have the potential to be a top embroidery artificer for the time being. Su Li was full of disappointment and shook her head slightly. That's all for today's class. You can go now. Wait. Jan Rulin's eyes were full of anger, and her expression was slightly distorted. She sneered and said, "You are not the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop. How can you say that I am not a top embroidery artificer? Let me tell you, I have already received the examination application of the embroidery workshop. When the workshop owner goes to the embroidery workshop tomorrow, I can immediately get the embroidery method of the top embroidery artificer. I want to see what you will say about me in the next class." Then, Jean Rulin left angrily, leaving the other 4 people with different expressions. Su Li sat at the teaching desk and propped up half of her cheek. After a while, she suddenly asked, "Gong Min, don't other people know about your grandma's things?" Gong Min couldn't hold it anymore and couldn't help laughing. "Yes. Except for Grandma, only Sister Qingru and I know it." Well, no wonder. Su Li's meaningful words made Yin Hongxiu's heart itch. She couldn't help but pull Gong Min's sleeve and asked in a low voice, "No wonder what?" Gong Min glanced at Su Li, seeing that Su Li didn't stop her. She immediately smiled and said, "Grandma also gave the position of the workshop owner to lecturer Su." So Jin Ruolin. Yin Hongxiu was shocked. She immediately thought of what Jin Ruolin said before and couldn't help giggling. Ran Ziden and Dong Xiaoxian also looked strange. They thought that Jin Ruolin seemed to be too unlucky. After the 4 people left, Su Li stared at the empty school for a while. Then, she got on Xiaowu's carriage and went to Ning Yunji's yard. Ning Yunji saw that Su Li came here without changing her clothes. He felt comforted. Although Su Li was young now, she had a respected status. But her attitude towards these old guys didn't change at all. This time, Su Li and Ning Yunji tacitly didn't mention the name of Qi Xianqing. They chatted casually, and time passed quickly. The pot of tea brewed by Ning Qing was also drunk. "Aunt Ning's tea is really delicious. It's late. Su Li will come to visit next time." After saying goodbye, Su Li left lightly. Ning Qing was full of warmth. She couldn't help but say, "This girl is too sweet. I feel embarrassed because of her praise. Alas, if Su Li is my daughter, how nice it would be." Ning Yunji couldn't help but snort and said, "Why did you refuse the marriage that year?" Ning Yunji felt something was wrong, but he saw that Ning Qing's face was full of frost. She turned around and left without saying anything. "My teapot is empty, Qing." Seeing that his daughter walked away without looking back, Ning Yunji couldn't help but slap himself. Why can't I control my mouth? When Su Li returned to her courtyard, it was already dark. "Miss, are you going out tonight?" After the last incident, Mammy Li had known a lot of Su Li's secrets. Su Li nodded slightly and said, "If someone asks, just say that I am going to the town to observe the embroidery workshop." "I will. Don't worry, Mississippi." After saying goodbye to Mammy Li, Su Li changed into casual clothes and left the school gate. She went all the way to the embroidery workshop in the Qinghe town and booked a room in an inn. Then she jumped out of the back window of the room and disappeared into the night. At this moment, beside the rather lively street, a half-story building was being built in full swing. The materials used were the best in the restaurant. This scene had been maintained for a whole 7 days, causing many passers-by to talk about it. Su Huanli was one of them. "I didn't expect that it was really demolished and rebuilt." Su Huanli was distressed. Although the Baiwei building didn't collapse with these 2 shops, he still felt that he suffered a great loss. If Su Li gained a firm foothold in the Qinghe town and used this shop to open a branch of the Baiwei building, how good it would be. Unfortunately, the other 3 shops were compensated to the Yang clan. The Su clan didn't even have a piece of land in Qinghe town. Chapter 85. In the spacious and bright atrium under the restaurant, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning were discussing the drawings in a low voice. Suddenly, Fang Yuan's ears moved slightly. The next moment, he flashed to the door of the atrium with vigilance. When Chu Qingning was about to take action, the door of the atrium was still pushed open slowly. Su Li, who wore a black night suit, walked in calmly. When she saw Feng Yuan at the door, she stopped as if she was a little frightened. Seeing Su Li, Feng Yuan was slightly relieved and said, "Why didn't you tell me that you came here? How did you come down? Don't forget who drew the drawings." Su Li chuckled and sat at the table. She asked, "How is your progress these days?" Chu Qingning smiled and came over. "Su Li, we are not lazy. You see, the addendum on the first underground floor has been built. Even the first floor has been built half. It has only been 7 days. Isn't it good?" Su Li nodded slightly and said, "I was also surprised when I came here. I didn't expect that the first underground floor had been built. In this case, you can start to transport the things of the yard here. By the way, how many taels of silver do you have?" Chu Qingning felt aggrieved and said, "Su Li, you said that you should build the restaurant as soon as possible. So, I discussed with Feng Yuan and recruited double helpers. Naturally, the expenses are high. It costs us 50,000 taels of silver to build the first floor. Don't worry. I will leave the remaining 200,000 taels of silver to you. Open the restaurant as soon as possible, so that our silver won't be like water without a source." Su Li took out the rest of the banknotes without blinking her eyes. Chu Qingning put them away and couldn't help but be shocked. Su Li was really bold. Wasn't she afraid that the business would fail? "Have you thought about the name of the restaurant?" Feng Yuan, who had been listening quietly, suddenly asked. The restaurant was about to be built with Su Li's money. Naturally, Su Li should name it. "I have thought about it for a long time. The name of the restaurant is Leanly Building." Su Li smiled and said. A ray of light flashed in her eyes. Feng Yuan was slightly stunned and nodded without saying anything. Leanly? Lingly? The atmosphere suddenly became a little dull. Seeing this, Chu Qingning immediately changed the topic and said, "By the way, what about those craftsmen? Since you've built an underground chamber, you naturally can't let anyone know about it. However, those craftsmen have all seen the blueprints. Isn't this a waste of effort?" Su Li smiled and took out a white porcelain bottle and put it on the stone table. "When the time comes, feed it to all the craftsmen, no matter what." Feng Yuan's face darkened slightly, and Chu Qingning's face changed immediately. He pointed to the bottle on the table and said, This is not appropriate, right? Those people." Su Li smiled sweetly. She opened the bottle and shook it. "What do you think this is? Poison to the intestines? If I really poisoned all of them to death, would I still need to open this shop?" Chu Qingning was stunned. He scratched his head in embarrassment and said, "I was wrong. What's inside?" "Make them forget something. The more they eat, the more they forget. You have to pay attention to the dosage when you put it in. It's best to control the memory within 2 months. Do you know?" Su Li warned him carefully. Chu Qingning couldn't help but marvel in his heart. Why did Su Li have all kinds of strange things? Even Nanjiang country, which was famous for its strange poisonous insects, was not as interesting as Su Li's poison. Where did she learn the poison skill? "Feng Yuan, can you recognize it?" After Su Li left, Chu Qingning couldn't help but ask. Feng Yuan shook his head and said, "If it's a well-known poison skill, how can there be so many magical recipes? Since Su Li doesn't say it, we can't ask." Chu Qingning rubbed his chin and immediately smiled. It's so interesting to follow Su Li. Feng Yuan glanced at him expressionlessly. Then he looked at Feng Ling, who was busy in the chamber, and his eyes softened. Back in the inn, Su Li carefully checked the traces of the house to make sure that no one had been here. Then she sat down at ease and began the day's practice. Although she didn't have the assistance of elixirs, her physique was extremely suitable for the Ghost Valley meditation direction. She had quietly practiced the Ghost Valley meditation direction to the 7th hurdle. Her practice speed was more than twice as fast as that of the 5th hurdle. From the Desu town to the Qinghe province, there were many troubles, but her cultivation was steadily improving. She had stepped into the peak of the inborn 1st hurdle and was only a step away from the inborn 2nd hurdle. Su Li didn't expect such a speed. The practice method and personal experience of this life were much better than that of the previous life. She didn't know how far she could go with the complete Ghost Valley meditation direction. Nothing happened that night. The next morning, Su Li got up early and went downstairs to have breakfast. Then she walked to the embroidery workshop that had just opened. There were countless people who came to the embroidery order every day. The door was open and no one was refused. Suli didn't show anyone her identity and easily got in. At the moment when Suli disappeared in the door of the embroidery workshop, Yin Hongxiu and the maid Huan also appeared in front of the door with their faces tightly covered. "Miss, how did you run out? Don't you have a literature class today?" Yin Hongxiu was peeping at the door. When she heard Huan's words, she immediately said impatiently, "Oh, I saw old Ning had dark circles under his eyes, so I gave him some medicine and let him have a good sleep. Don't say anything. Hurry up and go in. I'm waiting to see a good show." Yin Hongxiu's dress was really a little conspicuous. As long as people looked carefully, they could still recognize Yin Hongxiu. The guard of the embroidery workshop held back his laughter and blushed. He pretended not to see Yin Hongxiu and let her go in. When Suli walked into the hall of the embroidery workshop, she was immediately overwhelmed by the hustle and bustle. As far as she could see, there were businessmen holding banknotes and orders. They crowded in front of the table for accepting embroidery orders and rushed forward desperately. Ordinary embroidery was not valuable, but the fine embroidery produced by the embroidery workshop or the work embroidered by the top embroidery artificer was not only popular in the country, but also sold at a high price if it could be transported to other countries. Therefore, the business of the embroidery workshop was full every day. The situation in the hall would continue from morning to evening. Suli glanced at it and no longer paid attention to it. She turned around and stopped a supervisor. She showed the nameplate of the top embroidery artificer. The supervisor's expression immediately changed slightly. He took Suli to the back hall. When they entered the back hall of the embroidery workshop, the hustle and bustle became smaller and smaller. When the supervisor took her to the embroidery room, the hustle and bustle had completely disappeared and was replaced by silence. "Lady, I'm not familiar with you. I don't know which embroidery artificer you are. Could you tell me? I can lead the way." The supervisor who took Suli here was middle-aged. He thought Suli was too young, but he didn't dare to cross the line. The nameplate of the top embroidery artificer couldn't be faked. Even if she took the nameplate of her parents, he wouldn't stop her. The top embroidery artificer was highly respected in the embroidery workshop. As a small official, he couldn't offend her. "I don't know where my embroidery room is," Suli said. The supervisor thought she was right and said, "In this case, miss, why don't you go to the central hall and wait for your elders? It is the reception hall of the workshop owner. It happens that the new workshop owner will come to inspect today. If you are lucky, you can meet her." Suli slightly raised her eyebrows and didn't expose him. She said, "Let's go to the central hall." The supervisor was relieved when he heard that. If the miss was unreasonable, it would be difficult for him to deal with her. Walking from the back hall to the central hall, Suli and the supervisor met many embroidery artificers who passed by hurriedly with embroidery boards in their arms. Many of them pointed at Suli. Obviously, they were curious. Suli remained calm. The supervisor was amazed by her calm temperament at such a young age. At the same time, he was more and more curious about which descendant of the top embroidery artificer she was. The name of the embroidery artificer was on the back of the nameplate. He just saw the surface of the nameplate and didn't dare to let Suli turn it over for him. "Miss, we have arrived at the central hall." The supervisor stopped and pointed to an open room in the backyard. Suli looked over and immediately saw many acquaintances. She slightly raised the corner of her mouth and stepped into the room before the supervisor continued to lead the way. When the supervisor saw the people in the room, his face changed immediately. He knew something was wrong, but when he thought of Suli's identity, he braced himself and followed her in. Jean Rulin was trying to get close to Yin Hongxiu, who was depressed. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. She turned around and saw the person. Her face changed immediately. She said, "Why are you here? Who allowed you to come in?" Then, a sharp light flashed in her eyes, and her sight fell on the steward behind Suli. Her exasperated voice instantly broke through the roof of the central hall. "Gao Dahai, how dare you? She is not a member of the embroidery workshop. How dare you bring an outsider in?" Gao Dahai panicked when he heard that. He knew Jean Rulin. She was the daughter of the Jean family. She was unruly and temperamental. If he fell into the hands of this woman, he would definitely end miserably. I. Gao Dahai didn't say anything. Suli gently stepped forward and said with a smile, Jian Ruolin, I haven't seen you for a day. Your arrogance has skyrocketed. It seems like you don't take my words to heart at all. Jian Ruolin sneered and said, Suli, where do you think this is? This is not your warm room, but the embroidery workshop of the Qinghe province. You break in so openly. Be careful that you will be arrested by the government and be punished. Before Jian Ruolin finished her words, Yin Hongxiu laughed behind her and said, Jian Ruolin, you are really arrogant. I am not a member of the embroidery workshop. Why don't you punish me? Jian Ruolin's expression froze. She turned around and saw Yin Hongxiu with a dangerous smile. She immediately recovered her friendly expression and said, Miss Hongxiu, in the Qinghe town, no one dares to arrest you and put you in jail. Suli is just a commoner. How can she compare with you? Then, Jian Ruolin turned around and her face instantly became fierce. She said, Gao Dahai, what are you doing? Go and report it to the government. Gao Dahai was stunned. Looking at Suli's delicate and innocent appearance, he hesitated for a long time and didn't move. Seeing his reaction, Jian Ruolin was about to go crazy instantly and said, Guards, you are a group of cowards. Don't you dare to arrest a commoner who breaks into the embroidery workshop? As soon as she finished her words, a lot of observant stewards rushed out and were about to catch Suli. Yin Hongxiu saw that the situation was not good. She immediately stood up and shouted, Stop! The title of the satrap's daughter was naturally more important than that of Jian Ruolin. The stewards immediately stopped and stood aside. Jian Ruolin was stunned. She couldn't figure out why Yin Hongxiu stopped them. She hated Suli to ride roughshod over her. At this time, Suli finally moved. She stepped out and gradually approached Jian Ruolin. She opened her red lips. Jian Ruolin, you keep saying report to the government and punish. Does this embroidery workshop belong to you? You overstep your authority. Aren't you afraid that the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop will complain? Jian Ruolin immediately laughed and said sarcastically, Who do you think you are? Can the workshop owner speak for you? Besides, I am also thinking for the embroidery workshop. Even if the workshop owner knows it, she will praise me for doing a good job. No. If the workshop owner knows it, she will definitely not say so. When Jian saw Jian Ruolin and Yin Hongxiu in the central hall, he immediately felt something unusual. Speaking of which, today is the day when the gold embroidery artificer takes the assessment to become a top embroidery artificer. Workshop owner, can you start now? Suli shook her head slightly and said, I am not only the workshop owner, but also the lecturer of the Qinghe Girls' School. Jian Ruolin is my student. How could I not know her embroidery skills? Compared with the top embroidery artificer, she must be a little less intelligent. And today, Jian Ruolin, you are impulsive. You wronged others for no reason. You are too impetuous. How can you embroider exquisite works? I will punish you to reflect on your mistakes for 3 months. If you can repent, then you can take the test again. Jian Ruolin, do you have any objections? Jian Ruolin lowered her head and almost bit her lips to bleed. Finally, she suddenly relaxed and said in a low voice, It's up to you. Suli's eyes flashed a touch of profound meaning, and she nodded slightly. She picked up the bamboo hat and veil brought by Yin Hongxiu and said to Jian, Let's go to the embroidery room to have a look. Since I am here, I can't come in vain. Jian understood that Suli was going to instruct the embroidery artificer. There was a kind of expectation in his heart. He didn't look at Jian Ruolin and left the central hall with Suli, my bamboo hat. Yin Hongxiu stood up and watched Suli go away. She muttered with grievance. Suli really didn't regard herself as an outsider. The bamboo hat and veil were both brought by her. However, Yin Hongxiu didn't feel disgusted by Suli at all. She also felt surprised. If it were others, she would definitely scold them. Could it be that she would only lose her temper to those who were worse than her? Couldn't she scold those who were better than her? That's not right. The third brother is much better than me, but he is scolded by me every day. Yin Hongxiu couldn't figure it out. She couldn't help but knock her head. Then she stomped her feet and left. Since there was no fun to watch, she would go back to the mansion to continue to practice the bow. In the blink of an eye, there was only Jean Rulin in the central hall. Looking at the empty room, Jean Rulin took out the nameplate of Senior Embroidery Artificer. She stared at it for a moment and suddenly pinched it hard. Her knuckles turned white. Suli, I won't let it go. A commoner wants to be the workshop owner? It's so funny. Ho ho. Jean Rulin laughed in a low voice. Her laughter became louder and louder, and then she became crazy. The humiliation she suffered in Su Li's hands in the past 2 days was more than 10 years of her life. If she didn't take revenge, she wouldn't be the pearl of the Jean family. In the embroidery workshop, the embroidery skill was the best pass. Su Li covered her face and instructed the top embroidery artificers with Jian. Then she went to other embroidery rooms. In just one afternoon, all the embroidery artificers had accepted the identity of the new workshop owner. Although they knew that Su Li was young from her figure, no one dared to gossip in front of Su Li's embroidery skill. That night, Su Li went back to the school. Everything seemed very calm. However, the news that a commoner girl with no background became the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop had been known by all the big families through various channels. For a time, the undercurrent was turbulent. No one knew what would happen when Su Li came to the embroidery workshop. When Su Li returned to the school, she saw Mei Ruhan standing in front of the gate. She didn't know who she was waiting for. Mei Ruhan's eyes lit up when she saw Su Li. She ran to Su Li quickly and said, "Li, you've finally come back. I have been waiting for you here after class. I didn't expect that you really came back." Su Li hadn't seen Mei Ruhan for a long time. She also felt very close to her. She smiled and said, "What are you waiting for me for? Where is Gua?" Gua. Mei Ruhan hesitated for a long time and finally confessed. In order to lighten my burden, she went to do odd jobs outside the school. Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows and said, "Don't you have enough money?" As far as she knew, the Mei family was also a big family. They shouldn't limit Mei Ruhan's expenses in the Qinghe girls' school. It should be enough. Mei Ruhan blushed. She shook Su Li's arm and said coquettishly, "Oh, don't ask so much. Can you find an odd job for me?" Su Li couldn't help laughing. Mei Ruhan might have done something impulsively which led to the current predicament, but she was embarrassed to tell her. However, the Linli building happened to need a helper. She had already appreciated Mei Ruhan's cleverness in the Muyang girls' school. Since the opportunity was ready-made, there was no reason for Su Li not to use it. After thinking about it, Su Li nodded and said with a smile, "I know a place that is suitable for you." "Really? Where is it?" Mei Ruhan was happy. She wanted to have a try with Su Li. She didn't know anyone else in the Qinghe town. It was not suitable for her to find Ning Qing. Although Su Li was now a special class lecturer, she was too young. Mei Ruhan still thought it was easier to find Su Li for help. "It is a winery, but it is not an ordinary winery." Su Li smiled sweetly and said, "It's not enough to just study. Since you want to be an extraordinary woman with unparalleled wisdom, of course, you have to get in touch with the ways of the world and even the deceitful Jianghu. Are you willing to go?" An extraordinary woman with unparalleled wisdom. Mei Ruhan's eyes brightened. She nodded and said, "If there is such an experience field, Ruhan is willing to have a try. Even if I die, I won't regret it." Su Li's tone suddenly became cold and her expression was serious. Mei Ruhan was startled. Her face was slightly pale, but there was a heat that was different from fear in her eyes. "Even if I die, I won't regret it." Hearing Mei Ruhan's childish answer, Su Li smiled slightly and became gentle again. She said, "Go back and wait for the news. It will take me about a month to take you there." Mei Ruhan nodded and then said bitterly, "Li, can you lend me some silver? I will return it to you when I work in the winery and earn money." Su Li couldn't help laughing. She gave Mei Ruhan 1,000 taels of silver without asking more. After Su Li left, Mei Ruhan's heart was still beating wildly. She knew that Suli was not a person without a target. Since Suli said so, there must be something very important for her to participate. Meiruhan, who had never experienced any danger in her life, was very excited at the moment. Next, Suli's life in the school became calm. Every day, Suli would go to the winery early in the morning and would not come back until the building was closed in the evening. At night, Suli meditated instead of sleeping. She practiced hard all day long. Finally, she broke through the bottleneck after half a month and broke through to the inborn second hurdle. This speed was extremely fast, but Suli was still not satisfied. If she didn't use all the 400,000 taels of silver to build the winery, her practice speed could be increased by 3 times. However, Suli found that slow also had its advantages. She was reading widely. Although it had nothing to do with the Ghost Valley meditation direction, she could draw parallels and bring inspiration to her. Then her understanding of the Ghost Valley meditation direction went to a higher level. It was worth mentioning that she accidentally condensed the second kind of starlight with the secret method one night. This kind of starlight was not like any of the starlight mentioned by Qi Xianqing. Suli could only put it aside for the time being and wait for the opportunity to understand it later. Qi Xianqing said that the potential of the wood starlight was not enough to reach a higher realm, let alone compared with other killing stars. Suli condensed a soybean-sized green starlight at the fingertips of her right hand. However, I refined poison for many years in my previous life. Wood can be used as medicine and poison. In my hands, it can not only become a thing to save people, but also a weapon to kill people. And this, Suli's left fingertips shook slightly, and a faint fluorescence appeared. If Suli's eyesight had not been greatly improved after she reached the inborn hurdle, she could not see clearly who was inside. The shape inside is constantly changing, like a knife, a sword, and all kinds of weapons in the world. This kind of starlight, what is it? Suli was puzzled. Moreover, she still remembered that Qi Xianqing said that a person would only comprehend one kind of starlight in his life. Why did she have two? Was it because of her rebirth? Then, Suli denied this speculation. The Ghost Valley meditation direction she practiced in her previous life was a complete mess. There was no secret method to cooperate with it, let alone the horrifying star power above the inborn hurdle. It seems that the change brought by the second half of the Ghost Valley meditation direction. If so, this practice method is more precious than I thought. Suli's eyes flashed with contemplation. The realm above the inborn hurdle was simply a legend in the martial arts circle. No one even saw what the existence above the inborn hurdle would be. It could be said that no one in the entire Dahan country knew it better than her. She reached the peak of the inborn hurdle in her previous life, but she was stuck at that step. No matter how hard she struggled, she could not break through. Finally, she made up her mind to enter that kind of impasse. It was almost suicidal, but it also made her see higher and farther. If she practiced to the peak of the inborn hurdle in this life, and then stimulated by the star power, Suli was slightly shocked. At this moment, she thought of many things, but soon she gave up all the ideas. Chapter 87. As Suli continued to study her practice, time passed quietly. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Qinghe Prefecture was decorated with lanterns and streamers. The spring festival was coming. In the courtyard of the school, Suli sat in front of the window and quietly watched the snow falling outside. During the spring festival this year, her eldest brother, Su Qingtan, was meditating in the National Academy and had no time to go back. She didn't need to go back either. She just used the excuse of going back to the Qinghe school. When Su Huanli heard that it was the Qinghe school, he agreed immediately. He also told her to inquire about whether there were any cheaper shops in the Qinghe town. At this moment, Mammy Li came from behind and said, "Miss, young Master Fong sent a message saying that the winery has been built." Suli nodded. "Let's go there. There is no one in the school. It's not appropriate for me to stay here." Mammy Li took her luggage and followed Suli to the gate of the school. When the guard at the gate saw Suli, he immediately smiled and said, "Lecturer Su, are you going back for the new year?" "Yes." Suli smiled sweetly and said, "It's really hard for you to protect the school?" Ha ha ha. Not at all, not at all. Hearing Lecturer Sue's words, I feel warm all over. Have a safe trip, Lecturer Sue. The guard said goodbye warmly, not for anything else, but because Suli often went out in the past month, and every time she passed by, she would bring some delicious food for them. No lecturer in the school could do that. They were also human beings. Receiving such meticulous kindness, they were naturally moved and regarded Suli as a close person. No matter who came to ask about Suli's whereabouts, they would help to cover up in order to protect Suli, which saved Suli a lot of trouble. Walking on the street, Suli put on a cloak and a hat. Mammy Lee also put on her bamboo hat. In this world of ice and snow, the passers-by were hurrying, and no one would take a good look at their faces. On a second-class street in Qinghe City, a 3-story building stood out like a crane in a flock of chickens. It stood among a group of low-rise shops and was particularly eye-catching. The paint of the tall building was extremely bright, and its entire body was dark red. It was also made of this year's new wood. Just looking at it made him want to go in and take a seat. Even if it was just a cup of tea, it would be very comfortable. Why doesn't the Leanly building open? I'd like to go in and see what's going on here. I'm sick of the food in the city. I really hope this is a restaurant. Could it be a place for bathing? He. I see that this building is elegant and unique. It's definitely not what you are thinking. In the past 2 days, I've seen many manservants busying themselves with decorations. I believe that once they're done, it'll be time to open the door. Since I still have some red packet money on me during the new year, I'll go in and enjoy myself. Many people were looking forward to it. Some people estimated that the building would cost at least 200,000 taels of silver. This price did not include the land. It was much higher than the construction cost of a normal restaurant. At this moment, Fong Ling rubbed her small hands and stood outside the back door of the Leanly building. She kept looking around. Suddenly, her eyes brightened and she shouted, "They are coming." When Suli walked to the door, she heard Fong Ling calling. Then she saw Haydn and a group of people rush out and snatch the parcel from Mammy Lee's hand. They surrounded her and entered the building. Looking at the sumptuous dishes on the round table in the lobby, Suli had a strange feeling and didn't know what to feel for a while. "Sister Lee, these are all my work," Fong Ling said with a red face. "Although they are not as delicious as yours, they are the New Year's Eve dinner I prepared for you." Suli touched Fong Ling's small head and said in an unprecedentedly gentle voice, "Ling is great. I'll teach you to cook more delicious food in the future." Fong Ling had never been praised by Suli in such an exaggerated way. She said with tears and buried her head in Suli's chest. Fong Yuan looked at them, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. No matter what Suli's purpose was to build this place, it was enough for them to have a place to settle down and make them feel happy. Of course, it would be better if it wasn't called the Leanly building. Thinking of this, Fong Yuan felt a little sad in his heart. He didn't understand this feeling. He just felt a little uncomfortable. However, he never told anyone about this feeling, even to Chu Qingning. He was afraid that if he mentioned it, he would destroy everything in front of him. After the New Year's Eve dinner, Chu Qingning stretched himself comfortably and gave Fong Ling a thumbs up. The food cooked by Sister Ling is getting more and more fragrant and delicious. I don't know who will benefit from it in the future. Fong Yuan, don't you think so? Fong Yuan rolled his eyes and ignored him. Fong Ling cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks angrily and said, "Brother Qingning, eat your food. I want to be a very powerful person like Sister Suli. No one can marry me." Haydn and others laughed. After a while of laughter, Fong Ling and Haydn went back to their rooms to rest, leaving only Suli and others. Chu Qingning adjusted his mood and said, "Suli, all the wines in the yard have been transported here. Those craftsmen don't remember what they built during this time. When will we open for business?" "Open for business?" Suli pointed to the 3rd floor and shook her head with a smile. "There are only 15 of you. Can you manage the business of the 3rd floor?" Chu Qingning was dumbfounded. Yes, and it was not only the 3rd floor but also the underground. They were too busy. Fang Yuan gently knocked on the table and asked, "Go to the broker house to buy?" "Yes." Chu Qingning clapped his hands and agreed. "Su Li, what you build is not an ordinary winery. It is obviously not appropriate to recruit workers. The only way to solve the problem now is to go to the broker house to buy people. It is easier to control the life and death of the bought people." Speaking of this, Chu Qingning suddenly narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Speaking of it, if we didn't desperately escape, Fang Yuan and I would have become commodities for people to buy and sell in the broker house. Of course, it is more likely that we will die directly. It's really annoying to think about it." Fang Yuan frowned slightly and motioned Chu Qingning not to continue to say, so as not to expose too much. Su Li suddenly smiled and said, "I am not very clear about the past of you two, but I know your hatred. If you really want to take revenge, you should plan it slowly." Fang Yuan's expression was slightly stiff, and he looked at Su Li inquiringly. Did she really know? Or was she deliberately mystifying? Su Li seemed not to see Fang Yuan's expression and decisively finalized the itinerary. "Tomorrow, we will disguise ourselves and go to the broker house together." The next day, the sky was clear, but it was colder. The broker house of the Qinghe town was located in the most marginal area of the North City. After all, the slave trade was not a glorious trade, so the owner of the broker house consciously opened it in the farthest place from the satrap's mansion. Su Li and the other two walked here. They were all dressed in snow-white clothes and their sleeves were fluttering. After taking the bone-changing elixir made by Su Li, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning's height increased a lot. They covered their handsome faces and became ordinary, like two expressionless guards. Su Li's height also increased a few inches. She was dressed in snow-white clothes and wore a light gauze bamboo hat on her head. Her face was covered with a veil. She was very mysterious. As soon as the three people appeared at the door of the broker house, they were immediately greeted respectfully by the manager of the broker house. Just by looking at the guard's clothes, they could tell that there was only one distinguished guest. "May I know your name?" The boss of the broker house slightly bowed and smiled. Chu Qingning immediately snorted and said, "You can call my master Mr. Li." As he said, Chu Qingning was angry in his heart. Did Su Li deliberately take advantage of him? Why did she set up such an identity? He just made up in the morning and was confused until now. On the other side, Fang Yuan tightened his mouth and his face twitched slightly. Finally, he succeeded in holding back his laughter. The boss of the broker house was also stunned. "Mr. Li?" The person in the middle was obviously a woman, but he didn't care too much about it. He immediately said politely, "It turns out to be Mr. Li. Please come in. May I know who do you want to meet? We have all kinds of slaves, maids, prisoners of war, and clansmen, and they have all been educated and absolutely obedient. Let's see who can be the waiter of the winery first." Su Li said softly. Her tone was strange, as if it was covered with a layer of cloth. It was hard to tell whether it was a man or a woman. The boss of the broker house was so scared that his face turned pale. He didn't dare to ask more questions and immediately took the three people into the winery. He finally understood that Mr. Li was definitely a person in Jianghu. Those were all desperate people. He didn't want to make the master unhappy and die on the spot. He was even ready to send the servants for free. Su Li naturally didn't know the thoughts of the boss of the broker house. At this moment, when they entered the house to choose servants, they immediately smelled a faint stench. The boss of the broker house was about to apologize, but he saw that neither Chu Qingning nor Fang Yuan changed their expressions at all. Even Mr. Li seemed to be accustomed to it and didn't have any reaction. "Ada, you can choose some who can be trained." Su Li pointed to the cages with people in them and said softly. Fang Yuan's face darkened, but he still walked over and began to touch them one by one. Su Li said that they should choose the seedlings who could practice martial arts. What they wanted to train was not only waiters, but also the embryonic form of a force. The boss of the broker house stood aside and felt cold all over. The young man named Ada walked over and directly touched them one by one, regardless of the filth or hatred. Although there were people regularly cleaning there was still a lot of excrement. Generally, when people came to choose people, they let them out to sea. Mr. Li was so direct. After a while, Fang Yuan came over and shook his head. His voice was transmitted to Su Li's ears. Although there are two seedlings, their spirits have collapsed and they are too servile. They are not worth training. The boss of the broker house saw Fang Yuan shake his head and immediately panicked. He quickly said, "Mr. Li, it doesn't matter if you are not satisfied. We still have 9 such places. If not, we can go to the prisoner camp directly. I have a good relationship with the people there." "That's really helpful." Su Li's voice was indifferent without any joy. She said, "If I can't gather 20 people in the remaining 9 camps, I will bother you to take me to the prisoner camp in person." The boss of the broker house was in a cold sweat. He nodded repeatedly and said, "Of course. It's my honor to serve you." As he said, the boss of the broker house couldn't stop the fear in his heart. He was not so timid even when he met high-ranking officials and nobles. Why was he so scared when he met Mr. Li who covered his face? It was really weird. In the next 9 camps, Fang Yuan only picked out 6 that were barely acceptable. A group of skinny teenagers followed Su Li and the other 2. There were fear and imagination about the future in their eyes, but they were not numb and defeated. The boss of the broker house had been engaged in the slave trade for many years. At a glance, he could see the spirit of the 6 teenagers. He immediately understood that the servants Su Li wanted to find were not devoid of humanity. There were not many such slaves in the broker house. It seemed that they could only go to the prisoner camp. When he thought of his friendship with the prisoner camp, the boss of the broker house was bleeding in his heart. He bought them with money. There were fewer opportunities to go to the prisoner camp, but there were 3 ruthless people standing beside him. He didn't dare to say no. Taking the 6 slave teenagers, Su Li got in the cart of the broker house. Soon, she went out of the Qinghe town and came to the military camp stationed outside the city. Su Li glanced at it and saw that it was not only a prisoner camp but also a training camp for the official army. Chapter 88. This is a restricted area of the military camp. No one is allowed to enter. The young man shouted coldly, and his sharp eyes swept over the boss of the broker house and the carriage behind him. "Who are you? Tell me your name." When the boss of the broker house saw the face of the deputy general, he immediately looked bitter. How could he meet this little devil? He must have gone out today without looking at the almanac. He was so unlucky. Thinking of this, he had already jumped out of the carriage quickly and approached the young man to flatter. "Third child. Call me Deputy General Yin." The young man looked unhappy and corrected him coldly. The boss of the broker house was stunned and immediately changed his address. "Deputy General Yin, I am in charge of the broker house. The distinguished guests of the broker house are sitting in the carriage. If they are not satisfied with the ones in the broker house, I will let them come to the prisoner camp to choose. What do you think?" The young man frowned when he heard the words. The prisoner camp was connected with the broker house. He also knew that it was a secret rule of the military camp, and it was not easy to stop it. However, let them all come down. After I verify their identities, you can go in. The young man pointed at the carriage. The boss of the broker house changed his face slightly and sweated on his forehead. He didn't move for a long time. The young man noticed the strangeness and immediately snorted. He walked a few steps forward to the carriage, pointed the long spear in his hand at the carriage curtain, and said in a deep voice, "People in the carriage, get off." The boss of the broker house was about to cry at the back. He was afraid that the 3 people in the carriage were not happy and killed the young man directly. At that time, even he might lose his head, and the broker house would not be able to open. The next moment, the curtain of the carriage was slowly opened. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning walked out of the carriage and stood beside it. When the young man saw the 2 of them, his eyes were slightly fixed. The pneuma of the 2 of them was indistinct, and he couldn't see through them. That was to say, the cultivation of the 2 of them was at least the same as his, the acquired 4th hurdle, or even higher. The young man was shocked and couldn't help grasping the long spear in his hand. Such an age and cultivation were enough to be promoted to deputy general in the army. But these 2 people were just servants with others? What was the identity of the person in the carriage? At this moment, Suli came down from the carriage. The young man stared at Suli closely, but no matter how he looked, he couldn't detect Suli's pneuma, as if the masked woman was just an ordinary person. Was it possible for an ordinary person? The vigilance in the young man's eyes blazed, and he unconsciously restrained his tone. May I ask where this miss is from? Seeing that the young man was so scared that his face turned pale, Chu Qingning laughed secretly. He certainly did not expect that Suli was really an ordinary person, because his and Fong Yuan's cultivation was too confusing. With the guidance of young Master Ling Li for 1 month, plus their hard practice for several months, he and Fong Yuan's cultivation had made great progress. He now stopped at the acquired 7th hurdle, while Fong Yuan went 1 step further and reached the acquired 8th hurdle. Suli didn't know what Chu Qingning was thinking. She said slowly, "You can call me Mr. Li. I heard that the 3rd son of County Governor Yin is serving in the army. You must be the 3rd son of the Yin family, Yin Zai, right?" Yin Zai was not surprised that his identity was exposed. Even the boss of the broker house knew his identity. This woman had an extraordinary background, so it wasn't strange for her to be well informed. However, this woman had changed her voice to conceal her true appearance. It was obvious that he didn't want to reveal his identity. What he asked before was probably in vain. As for Mr. Li, it was obviously a pseudonym. Thinking of this, he looked serious and said aloud, "Miss, forgive me for being straightforward. According to the rules of the army, if you can't take off your veil, I can't let you enter the camp. Please go back." As soon as he said that, Fong Yuan and Chu Qingning looked slightly cold. A little light flashed through Suli's eyes, but she chuckled and said, "Child's eye, you are just worried that I will do harm to the military camp. If you don't mind the salary, you can go with us. If I really do something wrong, I believe that you can easily stop me with your position in the army, right?" Then, Suli didn't look at Yin Zai. Her eyes fell on the boss of the broker house. She said in a soft but indisputable voice, "Boss of the broker house, please lead the way." The boss of the broker house suddenly felt endless pressure and subconsciously walked to the prisoner camp. Yin Zai opened his mouth, but he couldn't say anything to stop her. He could only bite the bullet and follow her. He asked himself, if the mysterious Mr. Li really wanted to do something dangerous, did he really have the ability to stop it? A group of people passed through the military camp. When the passing sergeants saw Yin Zai and the team, they immediately let them go. Seeing this situation, Yin Zai realized that he was used by Suli without a trace. He couldn't help but feel angry. The boss of the broker house saved a lot of money. He was slightly happy and also prayed that Suli and others came here just to buy people. "Mr. Li, we arrived at the prisoner camp." Suli smelled the unique familiar smell of the prisoner camp. She smiled coldly and stepped into it. She was more familiar with this place than the boss of the broker house. The air was mixed with a foul and rotten smell. Occasionally, 1 or 2 yellow-faced and emaciated people could be seen climbing out of the tent. They were naked and blue with cold. It was almost disgusting. Fong Yuan and Chu Qingning looked slightly cold. They couldn't believe that if they couldn't escape and fell into such a hell on earth, how sober they would be. Yin Zai had vomited. His face was as pale as paper. He couldn't help but ask, why is the prisoner camp like this? Is there no one in the army to control it? The boss of the broker house seemed to have been used to the smell here. His face didn't change at all. He kindly explained to Yin Zai, "Deputy General Yin, you don't know. The prisoners in the prisoner camp are hopeless for the future. You see, those who are not wearing clothes are the weak ones among the prisoners. They are weak, so they naturally become the target of the prisoners. As long as no one is killed, the military camp won't care." Yin Zai fell into silence. As a deputy general in the army, he didn't know as much about the prisoner camp as the boss of the broker house. What he saw today had a great impact on his experience. He followed Suli all the way to the prisoner camp and didn't say a word. The 4 of them passed by a large purple tent. The rotten smell in their noses was stronger. Chu Qingning couldn't help but ask, "Boss, what is this place? Why is it so stinky?" The boss of the broker house cautiously glanced at Suli, who was walking in front of him, and whispered, This is the brothel of the army. The prisoner camp and the brothel of the army are the same. The only difference is that the brothel of the army is a little cleaner. The boss of the broker house emphasized the word cleaner, but no one could tell whether it was cleaner or dirtier. Chu Qingning's face was slightly red. Fortunately, he didn't show any flaws with the appearance-disguising pill. The boss of the broker house couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The two guards of Mr. Li were really cold-blooded. They didn't change their faces when they heard those words. The boss of the broker house thought his voice was very low, but everyone present actually heard it clearly. Yanzai looked around and couldn't help but snort coldly. He said, "You are hopeless." Before he finished his words, he saw Su Li's footsteps stagnate, and she actually stopped. "Mr. Li, what's wrong?" The boss of the broker house hurriedly went up to ask. Su Li's eyes were very cold. She pointed to the small tent behind the two purple tents on the right side of the road and said, "Since Adjutant Yin is self-righteous, why don't you go there and have a look?" Yanzai's expression was cold when he heard that. He didn't think that he was wrong. He said, "A group of women who abandon themselves to degeneration become prostitutes. Does Mr. Li have other ideas?" Su Li shook her head slightly and didn't answer. Yanzai snorted coldly. He went directly to the small tent pointed by Su Li and opened it. The next moment, he seemed to be struck by lightning. He was dull and couldn't move anymore. Behind the curtains, pairs of pure and fearful eyes looked at him. In the dim light, he could still see the rows of girls squatting inside. They were all 12 or 13 years old girls. Their bodies were covered in bruises and their clothes were barely covering their bodies. Some of them were even naked, not wearing anything at all. "Child Yin, do you think that these children will abandon themselves to degeneration and understand the desire of human relations?" Su Li's cold voice sounded behind him. Yanzai slowly raised his head and glimpsed her sarcastic eyes through the veil of the bamboo hat. He was extremely ashamed. These children are the womenfolk of criminal officials. They have done nothing wrong, but they are implicated. They may not be able to leave for the rest of their lives. Abandon themselves to degeneration? If I remember correctly, Child Yin is already 18 years old this year. You are so naive and lovely. After Su Li said it lightly, she floated away. She didn't look at the girls behind the curtain. She didn't think that she was a savior. She was even the opposite. Save people? How many could she save? She was walking on the edge of the knife. How could she be qualified to save people? "Mr. Li, Child Yin doesn't seem to follow us." The boss of the broker house followed Su Li and looked back every 3 steps. They were getting farther and farther away from the brothel of the military. "Don't worry, boss of the broker house. Don't forget what the purpose of this trip is," Su Li said coldly and sealed the mouth of the boss of the broker house who wanted to continue to ask questions. Shortly after leaving the brothel of the military, Su Li and others finally came to the center of the prisoner camp. Those who stayed here were all prisoners of war who had just entered the camp. Under the arrangement of the boss of the broker house, the officers quickly gathered the prisoners of war in the entire camp. A large group of people stood in the open space in the middle of the camp. Most of them wore exotic costumes. Pairs of eyes full of hatred, curiosity, or fear constantly glanced at Su Li and others who wore bright and beautiful clothes. In the past few months in the prisoner camp, they had learned to be obedient under the oppression of the military camp, at least on the surface. After the arrangement, the boss of the broker house returned to Su Li and whispered, "There are frequent riots in the Nanjiang country, so most of them are prisoners of war of the Nanjiang country. I heard that the Nanjiang country is very powerful in using poisonous insects. Mr. Li, you should be careful." Su Li nodded slightly and let Feng Yuan and Chu Qingning, who couldn't help but go in to pick people. After the two entered this place, their breathing became slightly rapid. It seemed that there were old friends of their Nanjiang country in this group of people. However, Su Li thought carefully and found it was not a coincidence. Feng Yuan and Chu Qingning fled to the Desu town one after another, which happened half a year ago. At this time, the prisoners of war on the battlefield were filtered layer by layer. The time when they came to the prisoner camp was almost half a year ago. The time was just right. Chu Qingning almost wanted to step into a ragged woman in the crowd, but when he saw the military camp around him, he took a slight breath and suppressed the palpitation in his heart. Then he started to pick from the first prisoner of war. At this time, he couldn't show the slightest flaw. Fang Yuan's performance was much calmer. He quickly cut in from the other side of Chu Qingning and began to pick. Soon, there were only more than 50 people left in the team of more than 200 prisoners of war. The prisoners who failed to be selected left disappointed. It was not easy for them to meet a master who seemed to have a strong background, but he didn't even pass the first round of screening. At this time, Yenzai had also come out of the brothel of the military camp and followed a group of girls. Su Li looked at Yenzai with a smile and immediately motioned Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning to continue to screen. What she wanted were not only fools who could only practice martial arts without brains. Fang Yuan took a simple booklet and picked out more than 20 literate people. More than 30 illiterate people had to leave sadly. Yin Xuedong's little face was as pale as snow. A gust of cold wind blew, and she suddenly shivered and woke up. She raised her head and saw only a dozen people around her. She couldn't help but be stunned. Chapter 89. From the first day Yin Xuedong entered the prisoner camp, people around her kept telling her that it was hopeless to get out of the prisoner camp in this life. Because the most basic requirement for those rich families to buy people was a healthy body, and Yin Xuedong stroked her soft right arm with her left hand. This arm had been broken for more than half a year. The tendons and veins in it were necrotic. Even the best doctor in the Qinghe town couldn't cure it. She couldn't understand why a disabled person like her would be selected. She raised her head and saw the woman standing in the crowd who had never said a word. That was her future master. What was her standard for selecting people? In the third round, Chu Qingning took the dictionary of Dahan and began to test the knowledge of the remaining people more deeply. Some people answered very fluently, some people stammered, and some people were pale and couldn't answer at all. Soon it was Yin Xuedong's turn. She saw that Chu Qingning pointed to the first word of the first line on the first page of the dictionary of Dahan indifferently. She suddenly opened her eyes slightly. She clearly saw that this person turned to the middle to test others. Why did it become the simplest first page when it came to her? The first word was people. Yin Xuedong became more and more confused, but she also knew that it was a good opportunity. She immediately replied nervously, "People are like you and me. They are all sentient beings in the world." Chu Qingning wanted to laugh and cry, but he finally didn't show any expression. He turned the dictionary of Dahan to the middle to test the next person. Soon, the remaining more than 30 people were divided into 3 teams. The first team couldn't answer, the second team answered half of the questions correctly, and the third team answered completely. Chu Qingning returned to Su Li. Su Li glanced at Yin Xuedong in the crowd, who had lost her right arm and was confused and a little excited. A ray of light flashed through her eyes. At this time, Fang Yuan also came. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Condensed the sound into a line and transmitted the sound secret. When Yenzai saw this scene, his pupils instantly shrank. Transmitted the sound secret was a secret method that could only be mastered by the masters in the acquired 8th hurdle. The origin of these 3 people was really terrible. When he thought that he was only in the acquired 4th hurdle, he couldn't help but feel discouraged. It turned out that compared with the people in the martial arts circle, he was not as good as a servant. Hearing Fang Yuan's words, Su Li nodded slightly. She inadvertently glanced at a skinny teenager in the first team. Then, she took the number plates of more than 30 people and began to pick the people herself. The boss of the broker house bent over and stood beside Su Li. He immediately shouted cleverly, "Those whose names I read, stand out immediately." Su Li looked at the boss of the broker house and selected 6 number plates and handed them to him. Zhang Hiniu, Li Sandan, Wu Yajun. Those whose names were called immediately looked happy and stood up. They were all in the team that couldn't answer at all. They didn't expect that they would be chosen, and they were overjoyed. The boss of the broker house stopped when he read the 6th name. It seemed to be over. Yin Xuedong's face turned pale. Sure enough, she was not there. Mr. Li, the boss of the broker house, held the number and asked with some doubts. The people she called out were not good. Why did she choose these people to buy? Su Li smiled slightly, and her strange voice sounded in front of a group of captives for the first time. Except for these 6, I want the rest. Boss of the broker house, calculate the price. Ah. The boss of the broker house looked at the remaining 27 people and was suddenly dumbfounded. Almost all of them were bought. In addition to the 6 he had brought, there were a total of 33 people. Big business. The boss of the broker house was happy. Suddenly, he thought of the origin of the 3 people and couldn't help but feel bitter. He said honestly, Mr. Li, the 6 boys of the broker house are not valuable. I can make the decision to give them to you. But you have to pay a sum of money for the captives. One person is 100 taels. 27 people, that is 2,700 taels of silver. Su Li nodded slightly and gestured to Chu Qingning. The latter immediately took out 27 notes with a denomination of 100 taels of silver and handed them to the officer. Seeing that Su Li was so forthright, the boss of the broker house immediately smiled. He helped the military camp to get so much money. His benefits were far greater than those of the 6 boys who were slaves. The officer was also happy to get the hot notes. He arranged 2 large carriages for Su Li to go back. Before leaving, Su Li looked at Yan Zai, who was a little distressed, and said slowly, if you can't make up your mind, it's better to let them choose their own future. Yan Zai was slightly stunned when he heard that. He was about to ask what Su Li meant, but he saw that she had gone away with the carriage. After coming to his sense, Yan Zai looked at a group of girls around him with eyes full of pleading. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He was really impulsive. As soon as they left the captives' camp, a group of young boys and girls sitting in the carriage immediately became restless. Pairs of eyes looked out and greedily breathed the air outside. Seeing that Chu Qingning was sitting on the edge of the carriage door and pretending to take a nap, the boy sitting in the innermost part of the carriage immediately wanted to escape. But as soon as he turned around, before he had time to climb out of the window, a knife suddenly flashed, and the tip of a knife was already against his neck. If he moved an inch further, he would see blood. The cold feeling from the blade immediately gave him goosebumps, and his whole body was stiff and couldn't move. Chu Qingning snorted coldly and took back the long knife. He said lightly, if anyone dares to escape again, I will not be merciful. Master only wanted to buy 20 people. Now there are 13 more. It's not a big deal if 1 or 2 people die. As soon as he said this, the people sitting in the carriage suddenly became quiet. They just got out of that damn place, and no one wanted to die on the road. Seeing that everyone was quiet, Chu Qingning sat down again, but he was so angry in his heart. Su Li definitely did it on purpose. She actually didn't let him stay in Xuedong's carriage. Thinking of this, he glanced at the thin boy sitting in the middle of the crowd, who seemed to be struggling to raise his head. He couldn't help but feel strange. He seemed to have seen this face somewhere, but he couldn't remember. Who was he to Fang Yuan? At this moment, the same escape happened in the previous carriage. Fang Yuan silently cut off an arm of the person who escaped, and the whole carriage suddenly became quieter than the captive's camp. In Xuedong shrank in the innermost part of the carriage with a pale face. She felt something was wrong. The person who bought them turned out to be from the martial arts circle. She used to hear people in her family that some evil families use people to do experiments, and the means were extremely cruel. She couldn't have been bought by that kind of family, right? Otherwise, why would they even want a severed arm? At the thought of this, In Xuedong's face became paler and bloodless. She just escaped from the wolves and entered the tiger's mouth? Just when In Xuedong was thinking about it and almost wanted to commit suicide, the carriage finally stopped. Everyone, get off in turn. Don't make noise. Hearing Fang Yuan's voice, the 2 carriages were silent for a moment. The first one to get off was the skinny boy. He climbed out of the carriage with difficulty. When he saw the gorgeous building in front of him, his expression changed instantly. With the first one, the remaining 32 servants got off the carriage one after another. When they saw the luxurious and exquisite 3-story building, they were all shocked. Were they going to live here in the future? Su Li and the others didn't stop and walked into the restaurant. After a while, Haydn and others came out. They were originally beggars and were trained by Chu Qingning and Ling Li successively. At this moment, they had already shed the inferiority of beggars. They were all calm and composed, quite like disciples of big sections. They were all wearing the uniform of the Linli building designed by Su Li herself. There were two kinds of clothes. One was the ordinary maid's clothes, which were light blue and pink. The other was the black and gold steward's clothes worn by Haydn and others. The word Linli was embroidered with gold thread on the right chest. It was simple but imposing. Many of the prisoners of war who had never seen the world couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. In Shuedong and the skinny youth's eyes flashed at the same time. They could tell that these youths all had cultivations. Haydn had never been so glorious as today. He was very happy. However, he thought that he had even met young master. Naturally, he wouldn't be frightened by such a small scene. Then he said loudly, "You are in the Linli building today. Those who pass the test and training will become the fellows of the Linli building in the future. Come with me." Haydn led a group of people to bypass the Linli building and came to the open space behind the Linli building. There were a lot of bluestone bricks and wood. Haydn coughed slightly and pointed to the bricks and wood. He said, "This is your first test. Whoever can build his residence can pass the test and stay. During this period, the Linli building will provide you with food so that you won't starve to death. As for the rest, you have to rely on yourselves. There are guards around this place. If you want to escape, don't blame me for being merciless." Haydn's words were not pleasant to hear, but everyone's eyes gradually brightened. There was something called hope in their hearts. They had been marked as prisoners of war. If they escaped, they would be killed immediately. They even thought about how miserable their future would be. However, they didn't expect that they would be bought as fellows. They would have food and shelter and even wouldn't be restricted in the future. Such a good thing couldn't be found easily. Almost without any hesitation, everyone immediately picked up the bricks and wood and began to build the house they would live in the future. The skinny boy's eyes burst with indescribable light. He grabbed a stone and was about to lift it up. However, he didn't move for a long time, which made others laugh. But the skinny boy seemed to have not heard it and continued to struggle with the stone. In Shuedong gritted her teeth and pushed the stone with one hand. However, her right hand drooped. She couldn't pile up the stone. How could she build a house like this? Many people's eyes fell on the two people. Where there were people, there would be a competition. The skinny boy and In Shuedong seemed to be the two worst among the 33 people. If there was no accident, they would soon be driven out of the Linli building and become beggars on the street or go back to the prisoner camp where life was worse than death. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Haydn to reappear. He pointed at the skinny boy and In Shuedong and shouted, "You too, come here." The skinny boy was sweating and panting like a tuberculosis ghost. It seemed that he would die in the next second. Hearing Haydn's shout, he dragged his feet and slowly walked over. A trace of anxiety finally appeared in his silent eyes. His weak voice came into Haydn's ears. "There is still a long time before the appointed date. I can build the house." He finally saw the chance to live. He didn't want to give up. In Shuedong was also pale. She held her right arm, and her beautiful eyes were full of begging. Haydn looked strange, but he still didn't say anything. He waved his hand and said, "Come with me." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.